The steaming coffee splashed across Colonel William Chase's pristine dress uniform as Nicole Fleming stumbled backward in Dixon's diner, her trembling hands betraying exhaustion from another sleepless night. Chase's voice boomed through the crowded breakfast rush, humiliating the struggling single mother as customers pulled out phones to record her public shaming. But when he grabbed her wrist and yanked her forward, tearing her sleeve in the process, everyone froze at what they saw. The intricate Navy SEAL trident tattoo on her forearm told a story that would shatter everything Summit View, Montana thought they knew about the quiet waitress who served their coffee every morning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other in Dixon's diner, with the familiar symphony of sizzling bacon, clinking silverware, and the steady hum of conversation that defined small-town breakfast rush. Nicole Fleming moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her worn sneakers silent on the checkered linoleum floor that had seen better decades. The coffee pot in her right hand had become an extension of herself after 18 months of serving the same faces, the same orders, the same polite but distant interactions that kept her invisible in plain sight. "More coffee, Mr. Patterson?" she asked the deputy sheriff, who barely looked up from his newspaper as he pushed his cup toward her. The gesture had become automatic. Like so many others in this carefully constructed life she'd built on the foundation of anonymity. Through the window facing Main Street, Nicole could see the morning light painting the crazy mountains in soft pastels, a view that still took her breath away despite everything. Summit View, Montana had been chosen for its remoteness, its tendency to mind its own business, and its population of people who understood that sometimes folks needed to start over without too many questions asked. Or so she'd thought. The bell above the front door chimed, and Cheryl Dixon looked up from the grill where she was flipping pancakes with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for 20 years. "Table for one," she called out, but her question died on her lips as she took in the visitor. Military bearing was impossible to miss, even without the dress uniform that announced Colonel William Chase's rank to anyone within 50 feet. Chase's presence changed the atmosphere immediately. Conversations lowered to whispers, forks paused halfway to mouths, and even the coffee seemed to stop percolating. Summit View didn't see many military officers, especially not ones wearing the kind of ribbons and medals that spoke of serious combat experience and high-level responsibility. "I'll take that table," Chase said, pointing to a corner booth without bothering to wait for Cheryl's response. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of having orders followed without question, and Nicole felt her shoulders tense involuntarily as old instincts stirred beneath the carefully maintained facade of civilian normalcy. She approached his table with the same neutral expression she wore for every customer, coffee pot in one hand, menu in the other. "Good morning, coffee to start?" Chase looked up from his phone, and Nicole felt his gaze sweep over her with the calculating assessment of someone trained to evaluate threats and assets. "Black coffee. Make it strong. And I'll need the check fast. I've got a meeting at the base in 40 minutes. Fort Harrison was nearly an hour away, which meant he was either optimistic about Montana highway speeds or accustomed to people moving mountains to accommodate his schedule. Nicole poured the coffee, noting the slight tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with caffeine withdrawal and everything to do with the way Chase's eyes tracked her movements. "Anything else I can get you?" she asked, setting the cup down carefully. Chase was already back to his phone, fingers flying across the screen in the rapid-fire typing style of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. "Just the coffee. And keep it coming." Nicole nodded and turned to go, but fatigue made her foot catch slightly on the uneven transition between the worn linoleum and the rubber mat behind the counter. The stumble was minor, barely noticeable, but enough to send the coffee pot tilting at precisely the wrong angle. The coffee arced through the air in what seemed like slow motion, a perfect cascade of dark liquid that splashed across Chase's chest, soaking into the blue fabric of his dress uniform and spreading across the ribbons and medals that represented a career's worth of achievement and sacrifice. The diner fell silent, except for the steady drip of coffee hitting the floor. Chase's face went through a spectrum of emotions, starting with shock, moving through disbelief, and settling into a cold fury that made Nicole's blood run ice cold. "You incompetent little—" Chase shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor with a screech that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. Coffee dripped from his uniform jacket, dark stains spreading across fabric that probably cost more than Nicole made in a month. "I'm so sorry," Nicole began, reaching for napkins from the dispenser. "Let me help you clean that up. I can pay for the dry cleaning. You just what?" Chase's voice carried across the diner, ensuring that every customer could hear every word. "You just don't give a damn about anything beyond this pathetic little life you've carved out for yourself?" Nicole felt the familiar burn of shame in her cheeks, the same feeling that had driven her to take jobs where she could disappear into the background, where nobody expected much and disappointment was measured in small doses. "It was an accident. Please, let me—" "An accident?" Chase stepped closer, and Nicole caught the scent of expensive aftershave mixed with the institutional starch of military uniforms. "Lady, I've got a career spanning 25 years, and I've never seen such blatant disrespect for the uniform." The accusation hit Nicole like a physical blow. Disrespect for the uniform. If only he knew how many nights she'd lain awake, remembering the weight of her own uniform. The pride that came with earning the right to wear it. The brotherhood that transcended rank and service branch. If only he knew what that uniform had cost her. "I said I was sorry," Nicole repeated, her voice smaller now, the fight draining out of her as it always did when confrontation loomed. 18 months of practicing invisibility had dulled her edges, taught her that the safest response was submission, apology, and retreat. But Chase wasn't finished. "Sorry doesn't dry clean coffee stains out of a dress uniform, does it? Sorry doesn't replace the time I'm going to waste dealing with this mess when I should be focused on real problems." Around them, the diner's patrons watched with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a car accident. Some had phones out, recording the confrontation with the casual cruelty of the social media age. Nicole could already imagine the posts, the comments, the ways this moment would be dissected and shared until it became another piece of small-town gossip. Cheryl appeared at Nicole's elbow, dish towel in hand and protective instincts fully engaged. "Sir, accidents happen. Nicole's a good employee, and she's already apologized. Maybe we could all just take a breath here." Chase's attention shifted to Cheryl, with the predatory focus of someone who'd found a new target. "A good employee? Is that what you call someone who can't handle the basic task of pouring coffee without destroying government property?" "Government property?" Cheryl's eyebrows rose. "It's a uniform, not a tank. It's a dress uniform that represents the United States military." Chase shot back. "But I wouldn't expect civilians to understand the significance of that." The word, civilians, carried enough condescension to make several customers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Nicole felt something stir in her chest, a flicker of the fire that had once driven her to excel in environments where failure meant death. But she pushed it down, swallowed it, buried it beneath layers of learned helplessness. "Please," she said again, hating how small her voice sounded. "Just tell me how much the cleaning will cost, and I'll take care of it." Chase studied her for a long moment, his anger seeming to crystallize into something colder and more calculating. "You know what? Maybe this is exactly the kind of wake-up call someone like you needs." He reached for her wrist, his grip firm enough to leave marks. "Maybe if you understood what real responsibility looked like, you wouldn't be stumbling around here like—" His words cut off abruptly as Nicole instinctively pulled back, the motion causing her sleeve to tear along a seam that had been weakened by too many washes and too many shifts. The fabric separated with a soft, ripping sound, exposing the pale skin of her forearm. And there, rendered in stark black ink against her skin, was the image that changed everything. The Navy SEAL Trident was a masterpiece of military tattoo artistry. The eagle's wings spread wide across the width of her forearm, while the anchor and trident formed a precise vertical line that spoke of hours under the needle, and the kind of pride that only came with earning the right to wear such symbols. But it was the text below that made Chase's face go pale. "Team 7, he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Afghanistan, 2019. The diner had gone completely silent now, the kind of quiet that preceded either violence or revelation. Even the coffee pot had stopped percolating, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Nicole looked down at her exposed arm, at the tattoo that told a story she'd spent 18 months trying to forget. The SEAL Trident wasn't just ink and artistry. It was a badge of honor that fewer than 3,000 people in history had earned the right to wear. It was a symbol of brotherhood forged in the crucible of training that broke most people who attempted it. It was proof of service in places where courage wasn't optional and failure wasn't survivable. Chase's grip on her wrist loosened, his fingers suddenly uncertain. Team 7, he repeated, and Nicole could see him running calculations in his head, cross-referencing dates and locations and operational parameters that weren't supposed to exist in public knowledge. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Team 7 was killed in action, the whole unit. Kandahar Province, 2019. Nicole met his eyes for the first time since the coffee had spilled, and Chase saw something there that made him step back involuntarily. It wasn't fear or submission anymore. It was the kind of calm that came before storms, the stillness that preceded decisive action. "Officially," Nicole said quietly, "Team 7 died in Kandahar. Officially, none of us made it home." The word, officially, carried weight that everyone in the diner could feel, even if they didn't understand it. It suggested secrets and shadows, operations that didn't appear in newspapers or history books, the kind of service that happened in the spaces between what the public knew and what the public needed to know. Chase's face had gone through another transformation, the angry colonel replaced by someone who understood the implications of what he was seeing. Team 7 had been legend in special operations circles, a unit whose exploits were whispered about in classified briefings and never confirmed in official reports. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, and the profanity seemed like a prayer. "You're Nova Fleming." The name hit the diner like a thunderclap. Nova Fleming was a ghost story, a legend that might or might not have been real. Special operations personnel told stories about Nova Fleming the way medieval knights told stories about dragons, with a mixture of awe and uncertainty about whether such things could actually exist. Nicole didn't confirm or deny the identification. She simply pulled her sleeve back down, covering the tattoo that had just rewritten the morning's narrative. "I need to get back to work," she said, her voice steady now, the tremor completely gone. But Chase wasn't done processing what he'd learned. "You're supposed to be dead. The whole team. We have casualty reports, next of kin notifications, everything." "You have what you were supposed to have," Nicole corrected, picking up the coffee pot from where she'd set it down. "Now, would you like me to get you a fresh cup, or are you leaving?" The question was delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested the subject was closed, but Chase couldn't let it go. 25 years in the military had taught him to recognize when he was in the presence of someone who operated on a different level entirely. "Ma'am," he said, and the word carried respect that hadn't been there moments earlier, "I owe you an apology." Nicole paused in her cleaning, looking up at him with eyes that seemed older than her face suggested. "You owe me nothing, Colonel. You were having a bad morning, and I made it worse, that's all." But it wasn't all, and everyone in the diner knew it. The revelation of Nicole's identity had shifted the entire dynamic, transforming a simple service industry mishap into something that touched on honor, sacrifice, and the invisible wars fought by people whose names never appeared in headlines. Chase reached into his wallet, pulling out a $50 bill that he placed on the table next to his barely touched coffee. "For the dry cleaning," he said quietly. "And for your service." Nicole looked at the money for a long moment, then back at Chase. "Keep your money, Colonel, and my service ended when my team died. I'm just a waitress now." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving Chase standing next to the table with his coffee-stained uniform and his overturned assumptions. Around them, the diner slowly returned to life, conversations resuming in hushed tones as people tried to process what they'd witnessed. But Nicole Fleming's secret was out now, spreading through Summit View with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By noon, everyone would know that the quiet waitress at Dixon's Diner was something more than she appeared. By evening, questions would be asked, research would be conducted, and the carefully constructed anonymity that had protected her would begin to crumble. And in the shadows of Summit View, people who had their own secrets to protect would begin to take notice of the woman who was supposed to be dead but was very much alive, serving coffee and keeping her head down in a town that had just become much more dangerous for everyone involved. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Word traveled through Summit View faster than wildfire in drought season. By the time Nicole finished her shift at Dixon's Diner, half the town knew that the quiet waitress who served their morning coffee was somehow connected to military operations that officially never happened. The other half would know by dinner time. Colonel Chase sat in his rental car outside the diner for 20 minutes after Nicole disappeared into the kitchen, staring at his coffee-stained uniform, while his mind raced through classified briefings and operational reports that suddenly took on new meaning. Team 7's mission files were buried so deep in Pentagon archives that even his security clearance barely scratched the surface, but fragments of intelligence had filtered through special operations channels over the years. Whispers about surgical strikes against high-value targets, about operations that saved American lives by eliminating threats before they could materialize, about a female operator whose tactical brilliance was matched only by her ability to vanish completely when missions went sideways. His secure phone buzzed with an incoming call from Fort Harrison, but Chase let it go to voicemail. Captain Derek Mills would be wondering where his commanding officer had disappeared to, why the morning's briefing had been delayed, and why radio silence had replaced the colonel's usual military punctuality. But Chase couldn't focus on base operations when his entire understanding of a classified program had just been overturned by a chance encounter with spilled coffee. Inside the diner, Cheryl Dixon watched Nicole methodically clean tables that were already spotless, her movements mechanical and precise in the way that suggested someone processing trauma through routine tasks. The lunch crowd would arrive soon, bringing fresh faces and new opportunities for gossip to spread, but for now the breakfast customers had filtered out, leaving behind empty cups and whispered conversations that would fuel speculation for weeks. "You want to talk about it?" Cheryl asked, approaching with the kind of careful neutrality that came from decades of managing both employees and small-town drama. Nicole didn't look up from the table she was wiping. "Nothing to talk about. Customer got upset, uniform got dirty, situation resolved." "Situation resolved?" Cheryl's laugh carried no humor. "Honey, that man looked like he'd seen a ghost when he read your tattoo. And the way everyone's been staring at you since he left suggests this situation is just getting started." The bell above the front door chimed, and Sheriff Gary Lynch entered with the measured pace of someone who'd received multiple phone calls in the past hour and was now conducting what might generously be called an informal investigation. Lynch had been Summit View sheriff for 15 years, long enough to know that secrets in small towns were like pressure cookers, building steam until something had to give. "Afternoon, ladies," Lynch said, settling his considerable bulk onto a counter stool that creaked under the weight. "Heard there was some excitement here this morning." Cheryl poured coffee without being asked, a gesture that had become automatic after years of serving the same customers. "Depends on your definition of excitement, Gary." Customer spilled coffee on himself, made a scene about it. "You know how it is." Lynch accepted the coffee but kept his attention on Nicole, who had finally stopped cleaning and was now standing with her back to them, staring out the window toward the mountains. That customer wouldn't happen to be the military officer who's been asking questions around town about government records and veteran affairs, would it? The statement hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Nicole turned slowly, her expression carefully neutral, but her posture suggesting someone who'd just heard something significant. "What kind of questions?" she asked. "Yucho." Lynch shrugged, a gesture that didn't match the calculating look in his eyes. "The kind that makes people wonder why a colonel from Fort Harrison is suddenly interested in a town that most folks drive through without stopping. Questions about who's moved here in the last couple years, about employment records, about anyone who might be receiving veterans, benefits under names that don't quite match their current identification." Nicole felt the familiar cold sensation that came with realizing operational security had been compromised. She'd chosen Summit View specifically because it was the kind of place where people minded their own business, where asking too many questions about someone's past was considered rude rather than curious. But if Chase had been conducting what amounted to a background investigation before this morning's encounter, then her presence here wasn't as accidental as she'd believed. "Any idea why he'd be asking those questions?" Cheryl inquired, refilling Lynch's cup while keeping her voice carefully casual. Lynch met Nicole's eyes directly for the first time since entering. Could be he's looking for someone specific. Could be he's part of some federal task force investigating benefit fraud. Or could be he's hunting ghosts that the government would prefer stayed buried. The word ghosts hit Nicole like a physical blow. It was terminology that wouldn't mean anything to civilians, but to someone with her background, it carried specific implications about operations, personnel, and the kinds of missions that left no paper trail and no survivors to tell inconvenient truths. Before Nicole could respond, the door chimed again, admitting Eddie Walsh with a tool belt slung over his shoulder and paint stains on his work shirt that suggested another morning spent maintaining the hardware store that had been his family's business for 3 generations. Eddie had the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent decades working with his hands, but his eyes carried the 1,000-yard stare that marked combat veterans as surely as any uniform. "Sheriff," Eddie nodded to Lynch, then turned to Nicole with an expression that mixed respect and concern. "Heard there was some trouble here this morning. Wanted to make sure everyone was okay." The speed with which news had traveled through Summit View's veteran community was remarkable even by small-town standards. Eddie's presence suggested that Nicole's revelation had already reached the informal network of former military personnel who'd settled in the area. People who understood the difference between service records that could be discussed and operations that officially never happened. "No trouble," Nicole said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Just a misunderstanding." Eddie studied her for a moment, taking in details that most people would miss, the way she stood with her weight evenly distributed, ready to move in any direction. The manner in which her eyes tracked the room's exits and potential threats. The careful positioning that kept her back to the wall and her hands free for defensive action. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "if you need anything at all, you just say the word. There's folks in this town who understand about service, about sacrifice, and about the kinds of missions that don't get recognition parades." The offer carried weight beyond simple neighborly concern. It was the kind of mutual support network that developed organically among veterans, based on shared understanding of experiences that couldn't be fully explained to civilians. But it also represented potential exposure, the risk that good intentions might lead to unwanted attention from people whose interest in Nicole's past had nothing to do with respect for her service. Lynch cleared his throat, drawing attention back to his presence. "Speaking of missions and service, that colonel left something behind when he rushed out of here." He produced a leather portfolio from his jacket, the kind used for classified documents and official correspondence. "Found it on the floor next to his table. Figured someone should return it to him." Nicole recognized the portfolio's significance immediately. Military officers didn't leave classified materials unattended, especially not in civilian establishments where security couldn't be guaranteed. Either Chase had been so rattled by their encounter that he'd forgotten basic operational security, or he'd left the portfolio deliberately, knowing that curiosity would ensure its eventual examination. "I could drop it off at Fort Harrison," Cheryl suggested, but Lynch shook his head. "Military property should be returned through proper channels, which means Nicole here, being former military herself, would be the appropriate person to handle the transfer." The suggestion was clearly a setup, designed to force another meeting between Nicole and Chase under circumstances that would allow for private conversation away from the diner's public setting. Lynch's casual revelation of Nicole's military background also served notice that her secret was now common knowledge among those who needed to know, regardless of how carefully she'd tried to maintain her civilian cover. "I don't think that's necessary," Nicole began, but Eddie cut her off. "Actually, it's exactly necessary. Military courtesy requires proper respect for classified materials, and leaving a fellow service member hanging isn't acceptable behavior for people who understand what the uniform represents." The gentle rebuke carried implications about honor, duty, and the obligations that came with having served in special operations. Eddie was reminding Nicole that isolation might feel safer, but it violated the fundamental principle that military personnel supported each other regardless of personal cost or convenience. Before Nicole could respond, the door opened to admit Pastor Carl Newman, whose presence immediately shifted the room's dynamic. Newman carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that came from managing a congregation's spiritual needs, while maintaining careful neutrality in a community where political and personal divisions ran deep. But there was something in his expression that suggested concern beyond simple pastoral care. "Sheriff, I've been hearing some interesting stories about this morning's events," Newman said, accepting coffee from Cheryl with the absent-minded grace of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere. "Stories that have people asking questions about our community's newest residents and their reasons for choosing Summit View as home." The comment was directed toward Nicole, but phrased as general observation in the manner of someone accustomed to addressing sensitive topics without causing direct offense. Newman's arrival also brought the count of people in the diner to 5, which meant that any conversation would now have multiple witnesses and the potential for further information leakage. "People always ask questions," Cheryl replied diplomatically. "Nature of small towns." Newman nodded, but his attention remained focused on Nicole. True enough, but some questions come from genuine neighborly concern, while others stem from curiosity that might not have the community's best interest at heart. The distinction was subtle but important. Newman was suggesting that Nicole's presence had attracted attention from sources outside Summit View's established social networks, people whose interest might pose risks to the town's carefully maintained equilibrium. Nicole made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "Pastor, if there's something specific you'd like to discuss, maybe we should talk privately." Newman's relief was visible. That would be appreciated. There are matters of community welfare that require careful consideration. Lynch finished his coffee and stood, leaving money on the counter with the deliberate movements of someone whose official business had been concluded, but whose personal interest remained engaged. "I'll leave that portfolio with you, Nicole, military courtesy and all that." The leather case sat on the counter like an unexploded ordnance, its presence transforming the simple task of returning lost property into something that felt like accepting a mission assignment. Nicole understood that opening the portfolio would represent a point of no return, the end of her civilian anonymity, and the beginning of whatever complications Chase's investigation might bring. Eddie Walsh lingered after Lynch's departure, his presence serving as both support and subtle pressure. "Ma'am, speaking as someone who's walked similar paths, sometimes the safest course is moving forward rather than trying to hide in place." The advice came from hard-won experience with the kinds of situations where inaction became more dangerous than engagement. Eddie was suggesting that Nicole's attempts to maintain her cover had already failed, and that her best option now involved confronting whatever forces had brought Chase to Summit View rather than hoping they would lose interest and move on. Newman approached the counter, his pastoral demeanor replaced by something more urgent. "There are things you need to know about this town, about why certain people might be very interested in your background, and about why some of us have been quietly preparing for the day when someone like you might arrive." Yakrao. The revelation that Summit View contained an organized network aware of her presence and prepared for her eventual discovery should have been terrifying. Instead, Nicole felt a combination of relief and wariness that came with realizing she'd walked into a situation that was both more complex and potentially more supportive than she'd understood. Cheryl locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, despite the fact that lunch rush was still an hour away. "If we're going to have this conversation, we're going to have it properly. Coffee's on the house, and everyone gets to speak their piece." Nicole picked up Chase's portfolio, feeling its weight and the implications that came with accepting responsibility for its contents. Whatever was inside would either provide answers to questions she'd been avoiding, or create new problems that would force her to abandon the peaceful anonymity she'd worked so hard to build. But as she looked around the diner at the faces of people who'd revealed themselves as something more than simple small-town residents, Nicole realized that her anonymity had been illusory from the beginning. Summit View hadn't been chosen randomly as a place to disappear. It had been selected specifically because it contained people who understood the difference between hiding and strategic positioning. The question now was whether those people represented salvation or a different kind of trap entirely. Outside, a black sedan with government plates pulled into the parking space recently vacated by Chase's rental car. The driver remained seated behind tinted windows, but the vehicle's presence suggested that morning's revelations had attracted official attention that extended beyond a single colonel's curiosity. Nicole's careful civilian life was officially over. The only question was what would replace it, and whether she would have any choice in determining that outcome. Nicole's fingers hesitated over the portfolio's brass clasps, understanding that opening it would cross a threshold from which there might be no return. The leather case felt heavier than its actual weight suggested, burdened with implications that extended far beyond simple military correspondence. Around her, the closed diner had transformed into something resembling a war room, with Pastor Newman, Eddie Walsh, and Cheryl Dixon arranging themselves in positions that provided clear sightlines to all entrances, while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. "Before you open that," Newman said quietly, "there's context you need to understand about Summit View and why your arrival here wasn't the random choice you believed it to be." The statement confirmed Nicole's growing suspicion that her 18 months of carefully maintained anonymity had been built on false assumptions. She'd selected this town through meticulous research, designed to identify communities where newcomers could blend into existing populations without attracting unwanted scrutiny. But Newman's words suggested that her research had been incomplete, missing layers of purpose and organization that operated beneath Summit View's surface normalcy. Eddie positioned himself near the window facing Main Street, his casual posture belying the tactical awareness that kept his attention split between the conversation and potential external threats. "Pastor, maybe start with Operation Sanctuary." Newman nodded, drawing a slow breath that suggested preparation for revelations that carried significant personal and professional risk. 15 years ago, a classified program was established to create safe havens for military personnel whose service records needed to be reimagined. Special operations veterans, intelligence assets, people whose continued existence posed risks to ongoing missions, or who possessed knowledge that certain parties would prefer remained buried. Nicole felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align in configurations that challenged everything she'd understood about her situation. Operation Sanctuary implied government sanction for the kind of deep-cover relocation she'd thought she was accomplishing through her own resources and planning. Summit View was selected as one of 12 communities nationwide suitable for housing individuals whose official histories required creative reconstruction. Newman continued. "We've provided new identities, employment opportunities, and community integration for 37 people over the past decade and a half." The numbers were staggering. Nicole had imagined herself as a single refugee, seeking anonymity in a remote location. Instead, she'd stumbled into an established network that had been managing similar cases for years, with what appeared to be significant organizational sophistication. Cheryl refilled coffee cups with movements that had become automatic during years of managing conversations that couldn't be overheard. The diner's been a natural gathering point. People need jobs that don't require extensive background verification, and food service provides cover for individuals who might otherwise attract attention for being underemployed relative to their apparent capabilities. Nicole looked around the familiar space with new understanding. How many of the regular customers she'd served carried secrets similar to her own? How many conversations had she overheard without recognizing their significance? The breakfast rush that had seemed like random small-town routine now took on the appearance of something more deliberate and coordinated. "Your file came through channels 6 months before you actually arrived," Eddie revealed, producing a manila folder that had been concealed beneath his tool belt. Former Navy SEAL Team 7, officially KIA but requiring relocation due to mission complications that left her exposed to hostile intelligence services. The existence of advanced intelligence about her situation was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. Someone within the government had been tracking her movements and needs, providing protection through mechanisms she hadn't known existed. But that same oversight meant her independence had been illusory, her choices guided by forces operating beyond her awareness. Nicole opened Chase's portfolio with steady hands, revealing contents that immediately explained both his presence in Summit View and his reaction to discovering her identity. The first document was a deployment roster for Team 7, listing 5 names including her own under the classification status terminated/non-recoverable. Below that, a second page contained psychological profiles suggesting that surviving team members might seek isolation in rural communities with significant veteran populations. "He's been hunting us," Nicole said, scanning additional documents that detailed search patterns covering 12 states and 43 communities. "Not for revenge or justice, for recruitment." Newman leaned forward, his pastoral demeanor replaced by something sharper and more analytical. "Recruitment for what purpose?" Nicole turned to the portfolio's final section, finding operational briefs that made her blood run cold. Counter-terrorism tasks requiring assets with no official existence. Operations in domestic territory that regular military units can't touch due to legal constraints. The implications were staggering. Team 7's supposed death had been engineered not to protect its members from enemy retaliation, but to create a pool of deniable operatives who could be deployed against threats within American borders. Chase hadn't come to Summit View by accident or as part of general intelligence gathering. He'd been sent to locate specific individuals whose unique qualifications made them valuable for missions that couldn't be acknowledged through normal military channels. Eddie's expression had hardened into something that belonged on battlefields rather than hardware stores. They want to use us as ghosts. Send us after targets that official units can't touch, then deny we exist if operations go bad. The casual use of us suggested that Eddie's background included experiences similar to Nicole's own, operations that had required similar cover stories and manufactured deaths. She was beginning to understand that Summit View contained not just one relocated veteran, but an entire network of individuals whose official histories bore no resemblance to their actual capabilities. How many? Nicole asked. In Summit View, 14 active residents with classified backgrounds, Wout, Newman replied. Nationwide, through the full Sanctuary network, approximately 200 individuals who've been provided new identities and community integration. The scope of the program was remarkable, suggesting institutional commitment to protecting special operations personnel whose continued existence posed security risks. But Chase's recruitment documents indicated that protection was being transformed into exploitation, turning Sanctuary into a hunting ground for expendable assets. Before anyone could respond, the diner's rear entrance opened to admit a figure whose presence immediately elevated the room's tension level. Dr. Stephanie Hunt entered with the controlled movements of someone accustomed to managing medical emergencies. But her expression suggested that whatever had brought her here fell outside normal healthcare parameters. "We have a problem," Hunt announced without preamble. 3 federal agents just checked into the Mountain View Motel using identification that doesn't match any current government databases. They're asking questions about employment records, medical histories, and anyone who might be receiving disability payments under names that predate their residence here. The arrival of federal agents transformed the situation from complex to potentially catastrophic. Nicole understood that her morning encounter with Chase had triggered investigative mechanisms that extended far beyond a single colonel's curiosity. Someone with significant authority was now taking direct interest in Summit View's unusual population demographics. Newman moved to the front window, peering through closed blinds at the black sedan that remained parked across the street. Vehicle's been there for 40 minutes. Single occupant, no movement, but the angle suggests surveillance equipment focused on this building. Nicole felt the familiar sensation of operational parameters shifting beneath her feet. The careful balance that had allowed Operation Sanctuary to function was being disrupted by forces that might not distinguish between protective oversight and hostile investigation. "Dr. Hunt," Eddie said quietly, "what's your assessment of our response options?" Hunt's medical background apparently included training that extended beyond civilian healthcare. Depends on whether we're dealing with routine investigation or active collection operations. If they're here to gather intelligence, we maintain normal routines and hope they lose interest. If they're here to collect specific individuals, we need contingency protocols. The existence of contingency protocols suggested that Summit View's Sanctuary network had prepared for the possibility of discovery and compromise. Nicole was beginning to appreciate the depth of planning and organization that had gone into creating what she'd believed was simple, small-town obscurity. "Nicole," Newman addressed her directly, "your exposure this morning has accelerated a timeline that was already developing." Chase's investigation was one of several indicators that Sanctuary locations were being systematically identified and cataloged. The revelation that other Sanctuary communities were facing similar scrutiny painted a picture of coordinated action at the highest levels of government. Someone with access to classified personnel records was methodically locating individuals whose official deaths had provided cover for new identities and community integration. Nicole studied the deployment roster again, noting details that had initially escaped her attention. Team 7 hadn't been the only unit subjected to manufactured casualty reports. Similar notations appeared beside references to Team 4, Team 9, and Team 12, suggesting a pattern of operations designed to create pools of officially deceased personnel available for undefined future missions. They're not just hunting individual operators, she realized. They're reconstituting entire units using people who officially don't exist. The strategic implications were enormous. Special operations teams whose members had been declared dead could be deployed against domestic targets without congressional oversight or legal accountability. If operations went wrong, deniability was built into the personnel structure itself. Eddie's tactical assessment was immediate and grim. That makes us witnesses to government policy that can't survive public exposure. which means our continued existence represents an ongoing security risk that someone is eventually going to want eliminated. The shift from protected assets to potential liabilities changed everything about their situation. Sanctuary had been designed to provide safety for veterans whose service had earned them respite from active operations. But if that same service now made them valuable for missions they hadn't volunteered for, protection could become imprisonment or worse. Hunt moved to the window facing the motel, using binoculars that appeared from her medical bag with practiced efficiency. Federal agents are conducting room-to-room interviews, systematic approach starting with long-term residents and working toward more recent arrivals. Nicole calculated time parameters with the same precision she'd once applied to extraction schedules. How long before they reach residents with sanctuary backgrounds? Based on current pace, approximately 4 hours, Newman replied, consulting notes that suggested detailed knowledge of Summit View's population demographics and residential patterns. 4 hours to decide whether to maintain their carefully constructed covers or abandon identities that had provided stability and community for years. 4 hours to determine whether Summit View's sanctuary network could survive scrutiny that appeared designed to either recruit or eliminate its hidden population. Chase's portfolio contained one final document that Nicole had initially overlooked, tucked beneath operational briefs and personnel rosters. A handwritten note in what appeared to be the Colonel's own script. Team 7 survivors represent unacceptable operational risks due to knowledge of classified domestic activities. Recommend immediate collection and reassignment to non-disclosure facilities pending evaluation for special projects integration. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the underlying threat. Non-disclosure facilities were military installations designed to house personnel whose knowledge required indefinite isolation. Special projects integration meant recruitment for operations that couldn't survive congressional review or public exposure. Nicole understood that her choices had narrowed to scenarios that offered no guarantee of continued freedom regardless of which path she selected. Cooperation with Chase's recruitment efforts meant participating in operations that violated her oath to protect American citizens. Resistance meant becoming a fugitive from forces that possessed unlimited resources and legal authority. But as she looked around the diner at faces that reflected similar understanding and grim determination, Nicole realized that her situation wasn't unique. Summit View contained an entire community of individuals who'd reached similar crossroads and chosen to support each other rather than face threats in isolation. The question now was whether that mutual support could provide effective resistance against institutional forces that viewed their continued independence as an unacceptable security risk. Outside, the black sedan's occupant finally moved, stepping into afternoon sunlight with the purposeful stride of someone whose observation phase had concluded and whose direct action phase was about to begin. The federal agent's footsteps on the diner's front porch were precisely measured, each step calculated to project authority without suggesting immediate threat. Through the window blinds, Nicole watched him pause at the door, noting the way he positioned himself to control the entrance while maintaining visibility of both the street and the building's interior. His partner remained in the sedan, engine running, eyes tracking pedestrian movement along Main Street, with the systematic attention of someone trained to identify potential complications before they developed. Agent Morrison's badge appeared first through the door's window, held at exactly the right angle to catch afternoon light while remaining clearly visible to anyone inside. FBI credentials, current but generic enough to suggest either legitimate federal investigation or sophisticated cover documentation that wouldn't survive detailed scrutiny. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Morrison announced as he entered, his voice carrying the kind of measured authority that suggested extensive experience with situations requiring delicate civilian interaction. "I'm Agent Morrison. I'd like to speak with the owner of this establishment regarding some routine administrative matters." Cheryl moved toward the front counter with the practiced hospitality that had served her through decades of managing customers, whose intentions weren't always aligned with her business interests. "I'm Cheryl Dixon, owner and operator. How can I help you?" Morrison's attention swept the room's occupants with professional efficiency, cataloging faces, body language, and positioning in the manner of someone trained to assess threat levels and escape routes simultaneously. His gaze lingered on Nicole for a fraction of a second longer than the others, suggesting recognition that might be based on photographs or operational briefings. "Ms. Dixon, we're conducting a routine review of employment records and tax documentation for businesses in this area." Some irregularities have appeared in federal databases regarding Social Security numbers and background verification for employees hired within the past 2 years. The explanation was bureaucratically plausible while remaining vague enough to justify extensive questioning about topics that extended far beyond simple administrative compliance. Morrison was clearly fishing for information about Nicole's employment history and documentation without revealing the specific intelligence that had brought federal attention to Summit View. Nicole understood that her response to Morrison's presence would establish the tone for whatever confrontation was developing. Excessive compliance might seem suspicious, while defensive behavior could confirm suspicions that weren't yet fully formed. The key was projecting exactly the right combination of civilian cooperation and mild irritation at bureaucratic intrusion. "Agent Morrison," she said, stepping forward with the kind of helpful attitude that characterized reliable witnesses and cooperative citizens, "I'm Nicole Fleming. I've been working here for about 18 months. Is there some problem with my paperwork?" Morrison's reaction was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone trained in reading micro-expressions and involuntary responses. His jaw tightened slightly, his breathing pattern shifted, and his hand moved fractionally closer to his weapon in the unconscious manner of someone whose target had just identified themselves without coercion. "Miss Fleming, thank you for speaking up. That's exactly the kind of cooperation that makes these reviews go smoothly for everyone involved." Morrison produced a tablet computer from his jacket, fingers moving across its surface with practiced efficiency. "Would you mind if I asked a few questions about your previous employment and residential history?" The tablet's screen was angled away from Nicole's view, but she caught enough reflection to see what appeared to be her photograph alongside text that included biographical details and operational classifications that shouldn't exist in any federal database accessible to routine investigations. Pastor Newman cleared his throat with the diplomatic timing that came from years of mediating community disputes and sensitive conversations. "Agent Morrison, perhaps this discussion would be more appropriate in a private setting. Ms. Fleming has rights regarding employment privacy, and I'd hate for any misunderstanding to compromise her position here." Morrison's attention shifted to Newman with a kind of analytical focus that suggested the pastor's intervention had been noted as significant rather than routine. "And you are?" Pastor Carl Newman, First Baptist Church. "I try to look out for the welfare of community members, especially those who might not be familiar with their legal protections during federal inquiries." The subtle emphasis on legal protections carried implications about knowledge of federal investigative procedures that extended beyond typical pastoral counseling. Morrison was clearly recalculating his assessment of the room's dynamics and the level of sophistication he was encountering from supposedly random civilians. Eddie Walsh shifted position near the window, his movement casual but strategically significant in terms of controlling sightlines and potential escape routes. "Pastors write about privacy rights. Seems like the kind of thing that should involve lawyers and formal procedures rather than informal conversations in coffee shops." Morrison's expression suggested someone whose routine investigation was transforming into something more complex and potentially confrontational. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern for Ms. Fleming's rights. But I should mention that this investigation involves matters of national security, which provides federal authorities with broader latitude for inquiry." The invocation of national security transformed the conversation's legal framework while revealing the true scope of federal interest in Nicole's situation. Morrison was no longer pretending that employment records were his primary concern, and the shift suggested that cooperation or resistance would now carry significantly higher stakes for everyone involved. Nicole made a decision that felt like jumping from an aircraft without being certain her parachute would deploy properly. "Agent Morrison, if this involves national security, perhaps you should speak directly with Colonel William Chase from Fort Harrison. He was here this morning, discussing matters that might be relevant to your investigation." Morrison's reaction confirmed that Chase's name was both familiar and significant to whatever operation had brought federal agents to Summit View. His tablet disappeared into his jacket with movements that suggested the interview phase had concluded and decision-making parameters had shifted dramatically. "Ms. Fleming, I think it would be best if you accompanied me to a more secure location where we can discuss these matters properly. Your cooperation would be appreciated, but it's not optional." The statement crystallized the moment that had been building since Chase's morning departure. Nicole was being taken into federal custody under circumstances that provided no guarantee of due process, legal representation, or eventual release. Her 18 months of careful civilian life were officially over. Before Morrison could move toward Nicole, the diner's rear entrance opened to admit Dr. Hunt, whose medical bag now seemed to contain equipment that extended far beyond standard healthcare supplies. "Agent Morrison, I'm Dr. Stephanie Hunt, Summit View Medical Clinic. Ms. Fleming is currently under my care for a medical condition that requires immediate attention." Morrison's expression shifted between annoyance and calculation as he processed the new complication. "Doctor, this is a federal matter that takes precedence over routine medical care." Hunt approached with a kind of professional confidence that came from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. "Agent Morrison, with respect, Ms. Fleming is exhibiting symptoms consistent with acute stress reaction following this morning's traumatic incident. Moving her to an unfamiliar environment without proper medical supervision could result in complications that would compromise any information you hope to obtain." The medical intervention was clearly tactical rather than genuine, but Morrison would need specialized knowledge to challenge Hunt's professional assessment without risking accusations of endangering a civilian's health during federal custody procedures. Nicole felt the room's dynamics shifting as the Veteran Network began implementing what appeared to be coordinated resistance to federal collection efforts. Each intervention had been precisely timed and strategically focused on exploiting legal and procedural constraints that might slow or complicate Morrison's mission. The front door chimed again, admitting Sheriff Lynch with the measured pace of someone whose arrival wasn't coincidental. "Agent Morrison, heard there might be some federal business happening in my jurisdiction, wanted to make sure everything's proceeding according to proper protocols." Morrison's frustration was becoming visible as his straightforward collection operation encountered multiple layers of local resistance disguised as routine civilian cooperation. "Sheriff, federal jurisdiction supersedes local authority in matters involving national security." Lynch nodded agreeably while positioning himself to control the room's primary exit. "Absolutely true, Agent Morrison, but federal authority still requires adherence to constitutional protections and due process procedures. Want to make sure Ms. Fleming's rights are being properly observed." The accumulation of obstacles was clearly straining Morrison's operational timeline and forcing him to consider responses that might attract unwanted attention to what was supposed to be a discreet collection effort. Nicole could see him calculating costs and benefits of escalating to more aggressive tactics, versus finding alternative approaches that would accomplish his mission without creating complications. Morrison's tablet reappeared, and this time he angled the screen toward Nicole with deliberate intent. The display showed surveillance photographs of her entering and leaving the diner, detailed analysis of her movement patterns, and, most disturbing, images of her daughter Abigail walking to school that morning. "Miss Fleming," Morrison said quietly, "I think you'll find that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than resistance, especially when those interests extend to family members who depend on your good judgment." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Nicole's daughter was being used as leverage to ensure compliance with federal demands, transforming the situation from one involving her personal freedom to one that endangered the most important person in her world. Nicole felt the familiar sensation of operational parameters crystallizing into tactical absolutes. Morrison had just escalated from attempting to collect an asset to threatening a civilian child, which crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed regardless of federal authority or national security justifications. "Agent Morrison," she said with the kind of calm that preceded decisive action, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of this situation." Before Morrison could respond, the sedan outside exploded into motion, its occupant apparently receiving instructions that required immediate departure. Through the window, Nicole could see the second agent speaking rapidly into a radio, while scanning Main Street for threats that weren't immediately visible. Morrison's own radio crackled with urgent communication. "Base to field unit, abort collection operations immediately. Situation compromised, federal oversight involved, repeat, abort, and withdraw." The sudden change in operational status suggested that forces beyond Morrison's immediate authority had intervened to halt whatever collection effort was underway. Someone with significant federal power had called off the operation, leaving Morrison with incomplete mission parameters and no clear authority to continue threatening Nicole or her family. Colonel Chase's voice carried clearly across the radio frequency. "Agent Morrison, this is Colonel William Chase, Joint Chiefs Liaison. You are ordered to stand down immediately and report to Fort Harrison for debriefing." Federal collection operations in Summit View are suspended pending review of operational authorization. Morrison's expression showed someone whose mission had been terminated by higher authority, leaving him with no legal basis for continuing his investigation or carrying out threatened actions against Nicole's family. His tablet disappeared into his jacket with movements that suggested defeat rather than tactical withdrawal. "Ms. Fleming," Morrison said formally, "this matter is being referred to appropriate military authorities. You should expect further contact through proper channels." The federal agent's departure left the diner's occupants in possession of valuable intelligence about the scope and nature of operations targeting Summit View's sanctuary network. But it also confirmed that their security had been comprehensively compromised and that protection would now depend on resources and capabilities that extended beyond simple small-town anonymity. As Morrison's sedan disappeared down Main Street, Nicole realized that Colonel Chase's intervention had created an unexpected alliance with someone whose morning antagonism had transformed into protection for her and her daughter. The redemption arc she'd witnessed in Chase's portfolio documents was apparently translating into concrete actions that prioritized her safety over federal recruitment efforts. But the temporary reprieve also meant that larger forces were now aware of Summit View's significance and would eventually return with different approaches and greater resources. The sanctuary network's cover was blown, and its continued existence would require transition from passive concealment to active defense against institutional threats that possessed unlimited authority and legal immunity. Nicole's first priority was Abigail, and the urgency that drove her through Summit View's residential streets had nothing to do with federal agents or classified operations. Every maternal instinct screamed warnings about her daughter's vulnerability now that their carefully maintained anonymity had been shattered. The elementary school sat 3 blocks from the diner, its playground visible through chain-link fencing that suddenly seemed inadequate protection against threats that possessed government authority and unlimited resources. Principal Margaret Stone intercepted Nicole at the school's main entrance, her expression mixing professional concern with something deeper that suggested awareness of morning developments. "Miss Fleming, Abigail's in my office. She's perfectly safe, but we need to discuss some security arrangements that have become necessary." The fact that Stone was prepared for Nicole's arrival indicated communication networks that extended beyond the veteran community into Summit View's broader institutional structure. Nicole followed the principal through hallways lined with children's artwork and motivational posters that belonged to a world where threats came from playground bullies rather than federal collection operations. Abigail sat in an oversized chair beside Stone's desk, her 8-year-old frame dwarfed by furniture designed for adult conversations. She looked up as Nicole entered, brown eyes reflecting confusion about why her normal school day had been disrupted by adults whose behavior suggested serious problems beyond her understanding. "Mommy, Mrs. Stone says we might need to go on a special trip. Are we in trouble?" Nicole knelt beside her daughter's chair, forcing her voice to remain calm, despite internal alarms that screamed about exposure, pursuit, and the collapse of everything she'd built to provide Abigail with stability and normalcy. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have to make quick decisions about keeping families safe. Remember how we practiced what to do if we ever needed to leave quickly?" Abigail nodded solemnly. Their emergency protocols had been disguised as games, but Nicole had ensured her daughter understood the importance of following instructions without question during what she'd called practice adventures. The preparations that had seemed like paranoid overcaution 18 months ago now represented the difference between controlled evacuation and panicked flight. Stone moved to her window, checking the parking lot with practiced efficiency that suggested security training beyond standard educational administration. There are people positioned around the school's perimeter. Not threatening, but definitely maintaining surveillance. Mrs. Mason contacted me 20 minutes ago with instructions about protective protocols. Mrs. Pearl Mason's involvement indicated that the Veteran Network's response to federal interest included coordinated child protection measures that had been planned well in advance of any specific crisis. Nicole felt simultaneous relief and unease at discovering that her daughter's safety had been considered by people whose capabilities she was only beginning to understand. Where would be safest, Nicole asked, understanding that her decision-making authority was now constrained by circumstances beyond her control. Before Stone could respond, the office phone rang with the sharp insistence that marked urgent communication. She answered with practiced professionalism. "Summit View Elementary," Principal Stone speaking. The conversation was brief and conducted in language that sounded routine but carried undertones of coded communication. Stone's responses were carefully neutral, providing no information about student locations or security arrangements while acknowledging that certain protocols were being implemented. "That was Dr. Hunt," Stone explained after ending the call. "Medical emergency at the clinic requires immediate consultation about student health records. I need to leave for approximately 1 hour, which means my office will be unoccupied during that time." The explanation was clearly choreographed to provide Nicole with opportunity to move Abigail without creating official documentation of their departure. Stone was risking her professional position to provide cover for what amounted to child extraction from federal surveillance. Nicole gathered Abigail's backpack and jacket, checking contents that included the emergency supplies she'd insisted her daughter carry without explanation. Energy bars, water bottle, small flashlight, and $20 in cash wouldn't sustain extended flight, but they represented preparation for situations that required immediate mobility. "Where are we going on our adventure?" Abigail asked as they left Stone's office through a rear exit that provided access to residential streets without crossing the main parking lot where surveillance teams maintained their positions. "To visit some new friends who want to make sure we're safe," Nicole replied, steering them toward a path that wound between houses whose windows might conceal additional watchers but whose backyards offered concealment from street-level observation. Mrs. Mason's house appeared through tall pine trees that provided natural screening from aerial surveillance. The elderly woman stood on her back porch, beckoning them forward with movements that were casual but purposeful. Her property backed up to national forest land, offering escape routes that couldn't be monitored by conventional surveillance methods. "You must be Abigail," Mason said as they approached. "I've heard wonderful things about you from your mother's friends. Would you like some cookies while the grown-ups talk about boring things?" Abigail accepted the offer with the adaptability that children displayed when adults they trusted indicated that unusual circumstances required flexible responses to changing situations. Mason led her inside, leaving Nicole on the porch with Eddie Walsh, who had arrived through forest paths that avoided street surveillance entirely. "Situations evolving faster than anyone anticipated," Eddie reported, producing a handheld radio that crackled with encrypted communications. Chase contacted Newman directly. He's requesting face-to-face meeting to discuss what he's calling mutually beneficial cooperation against common threats. The proposal suggested that Chase's intervention against Morrison represented more than momentary conscience. If the colonel was willing to meet with Sanctuary Network leadership, his redemption arc might be advancing toward genuine alliance rather than simple protection of Nicole's immediate safety. "What kind of common threats?" Nicole asked, though she suspected the answer involved forces that extended far beyond Agent Morrison's collection efforts. Eddie's expression carried the grim satisfaction of someone whose worst suspicions were being confirmed by developing events. According to Chase, the federal operation against sanctuary communities is part of something larger: systematic identification and collection of special operations personnel for integration into domestic counterterrorism programs that Congress doesn't know about. The revelation that congressional oversight was being bypassed transformed the situation from one involving military recruitment to one that threatened constitutional governance itself. If special operations units were being reconstituted for domestic operations without legislative authorization, the implications extended far beyond individual freedom to fundamental questions about military authority within American borders. Mason returned from settling Abigail with activities that would keep her occupied, while adults discussed topics that children shouldn't overhear. "Colonel Chase is en route, expected arrival in 15 minutes. He's requested assurance that this meeting will be conducted without recording devices or hostile surveillance." The colonel's security concerns suggested that his decision to ally with the Sanctuary Network carried personal risks that extended beyond career consequences to potential criminal charges for violating federal operations and revealing classified intelligence to unauthorized personnel. Nicole felt the weight of decisions that would affect not only her own future but the safety of 14 other Sanctuary residents and their families. Chase's offer of cooperation might represent genuine alliance or sophisticated entrapment designed to collect multiple assets simultaneously through manipulation of their mutual protection instincts. "What's your assessment of his reliability?" she asked Eddie, understanding that trust decisions made under current circumstances would determine survival outcomes for everyone involved. Eddie consulted his radio, receiving updates from network members positioned throughout Summit View to monitor federal activities and Chase's approach. "Sheriff Lynch confirms no federal backup following his vehicle. Dr. Hunt reports no additional government communications intercepted through medical monitoring equipment. Newman's assessment is that Chase is either genuine or running the most sophisticated deception operation any of us have encountered. The risk-benefit analysis was complex, but ultimately reducible to simple terms. Continuing resistance without additional intelligence about federal plans meant fighting blind against opponents who possessed comprehensive information about sanctuary locations and personnel. Accepting Chase's cooperation offer might provide crucial intelligence while creating vulnerability to betrayal that could destroy everything they'd worked to protect. Mason's back door opened to admit Colonel Chase, whose appearance had been transformed since morning by the removal of his coffee-stained dress uniform in favor of civilian clothing that suggested someone attempting to minimize his military identity. His bearing remained unmistakably martial, but his expression carried humility that hadn't been present during his antagonistic diner performance. "Ms. Fleming," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that acknowledged her authority rather than demanding deference to his rank. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I have information that affects everyone in this community, and I believe we share interests that override our morning misunderstanding." Nicole accepted the handshake while maintaining tactical awareness that included positioning near exits and evaluation of Chase's potential threat level, despite his apparently conciliatory approach. "Colonel, my primary concern is protecting my daughter and the people who've shown me kindness here. If your information serves those goals, I'm listening." Chase produced a briefcase that was smaller than the portfolio he'd left at the diner but carried similar implications about classified materials being shared beyond authorized channels. The federal operation targeting sanctuary communities is being conducted under Executive Order 14,823, which authorizes collection of military personnel whose continued existence poses risks to ongoing national security operations. The reference to an executive order provided legal framework for activities that had appeared to violate constitutional protections and due process requirements, but it also suggested that presidential authority was being invoked to bypass congressional oversight and judicial review in ways that might not survive constitutional challenge. Executive Order 14,823 was signed 3 months ago, Chase continued, classifying former Special Operations personnel as potential security risks requiring evaluation for integration into domestic counterterrorism programs. The order specifically targets individuals whose official records indicate death in combat but whose actual status involves relocation under assumed identities. Nicole felt pieces of a larger puzzle crystallizing into configurations that revealed systematic planning extending far beyond her individual situation. Operation Sanctuary hadn't been created to protect veterans from foreign threats, but to catalog and control them for future domestic deployment against targets that regular military units couldn't legally engage. Eddie's tactical assessment was immediate and devastating. "They've been farming us from the beginning, creating isolated communities where they could maintain surveillance and control while developing psychological profiles to determine our suitability for illegal operations." The revelation transformed 18 months of supposed sanctuary into an elaborate containment operation designed to study and eventually exploit individuals whose capabilities made them valuable for missions that couldn't survive public scrutiny or congressional review. Mason's grandmother instincts focused on practical implications rather than strategic betrayal. What does this mean for our families? For children who've built lives here thinking they were safe? Chase's expression reflected someone whose career-long faith and institutional authority had been shattered by discovery of operations that violated every principle he'd sworn to defend. It means that cooperation with federal collection efforts leads to indefinite detention and forced participation in operations against American civilians. And resistance leads to classification as domestic terrorists subject to elimination without trial. The binary choice between submission and destruction represented institutional warfare against veterans whose service had earned them protection rather than exploitation. Nicole understood that their situation had moved beyond individual survival to collective resistance against forces that viewed constitutional protections as obstacles to operational efficiency. "What kind of cooperation are you offering?" Nicole asked, understanding that Chase's presence represented either salvation or the most sophisticated trap any of them had ever encountered. Chase opened his briefcase, revealing documents that carried classifications she hadn't seen since her operational days with Team 7. Intelligence about federal operations, advance warning of collection efforts, and military resources that can be deployed without official authorization. The offer implied that Chase was prepared to commit treason against his own government in service of principles that superseded institutional loyalty. Nicole recognized the magnitude of his decision while understanding that trust built under current circumstances would determine whether any of them survived the next week with their freedom intact. "Colonel," she said quietly, "helping us makes you a target for the same forces that are hunting us. Are you prepared for what that means?" Chase met her eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd made peace with consequences that couldn't be avoided or minimized. "Miss Fleming, I've spent 25 years following orders that I believed served American interests. I won't spend another day participating in operations that treat American veterans as enemy combatants." Outside, radio traffic indicated that federal surveillance teams were repositioning around Summit View's perimeter, suggesting that Chase's meeting with Sanctuary leadership had been detected and was now being monitored by forces whose response options included military action against civilian populations. The alliance Nicole was being offered might represent their best hope for survival, but accepting it would also transform their defensive position into active resistance against institutional power that possessed unlimited authority and resources. Abigail's laughter carried from Mason's kitchen, where she remained blissfully unaware that her mother was deciding whether to trust a man whose protection might preserve her childhood or whose betrayal could destroy everything they'd built together in Summit View. The radio crackled with urgent chatter as federal positioning around Summit View shifted from surveillance to active containment. Chase monitored the frequencies with practiced efficiency, his military training allowing him to decode tactical communications that revealed deployment patterns designed to prevent escape rather than simply observe activity. The transformation from watching to trapping meant that decisions made in the next hour would determine whether anyone in the Sanctuary network retained their freedom beyond nightfall. On tap. Nicole studied the documents Chase had shared, her operational experience allowing her to recognize authentication codes and classification levels that proved their legitimacy. Executive Order 14,823 wasn't just bureaucratic overreach, but systematic betrayal of veterans whose service had earned them protection rather than exploitation. The legal framework provided cover for activities that violated every constitutional principle, while creating deniable authority for operations that no democratic society should tolerate. "How many sanctuary communities are being targeted simultaneously?" she asked, understanding that Summit View's situation might be part of coordinated action against multiple locations. Chase consulted encrypted messages on his secure phone, receiving updates from sources within military command structures who shared his growing disillusionment with institutional policies. 11 communities across 7 states. Collection operations began this morning, synchronized to prevent communication between networks and minimize organized resistance. The scope of federal action indicated planning that had taken months to coordinate and represented institutional commitment to eliminating sanctuary programs that had operated successfully for over a decade. Someone with significant authority had decided that protecting veterans was less important than controlling them for missions that couldn't survive public scrutiny. Eddie Walsh positioned himself near Mason's front window, using binoculars to track federal movement patterns that were becoming increasingly obvious despite attempts at discretion. Perimeters tightening, they're establishing checkpoint positions on all roads leading out of town. Classic containment doctrine, except they're applying it to American civilians on American soil. The application of military tactics against domestic populations crossed lines that even wartime operations rarely approached. Nicole understood that federal forces were treating Summit View as enemy territory, which meant that rules of engagement might not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants if resistance developed. Mrs. Mason emerged from the kitchen, where Abigail remained occupied with activities designed to shield her from adult conversations about threats she couldn't understand. More families are arriving. The Hendersons brought their twins, the Kowalskis have their elderly father with them. We're looking at 23 people who need immediate protection. The refugee count included children, elderly relatives, and spouses whose only connection to special operations involved marriage to veterans whose service had marked them for federal collection. Nicole felt the weight of responsibility expanding beyond her personal situation to encompass an entire community whose safety now depended on decisions made by people with no authority beyond their shared commitment to protecting innocent lives. Chase's phone buzzed with an incoming call that he answered with military precision. Chase here." The conversation was brief but significant, conducted in language that carried implications about institutional fractures extending beyond individual conscience to organized resistance within federal agencies. When Chase ended the call, his expression reflected someone whose understanding of their situation had just evolved in directions that offered both hope and additional complexity. "That was Detective Christina Bell with State Police," he explained. "She's been conducting her own investigation into federal activities in this area. Apparently, Executive Order 14,823 wasn't properly filed with congressional oversight committees, which means it lacks legal authority for domestic military operations. The revelation that the executive order might be unconstitutional provided potential legal challenges to federal collection efforts, but also meant that current operations were being conducted without legitimate authority by agencies that possessed unlimited resources and institutional protection." Nicole processed the implications with tactical precision that had once kept her alive in environments where political considerations were luxury rather than necessity. Illegal orders don't become legal just because people with badges are following them. If Bell can prove constitutional violations, we might have recourse through federal courts. "Provided we survive long enough to reach federal courts," Eddie observed grimly. "Illegal operations tend to eliminate witnesses who can testify about their illegality." The practical assessment focused attention on immediate survival rather than long-term legal remedies. Nicole understood that her choices had narrowed to scenarios that offered no guarantee of safety regardless of which path she selected, but also recognized that passive acceptance of federal collection guaranteed outcomes that were completely unacceptable. "Eidladstid," Mason's radio crackled with communication from Sheriff Lynch, whose voice carried tension that hadn't been present during morning interactions. "All units, federal forces are requesting local assistance with what they're calling terrorist apprehension operations. I've declined to provide support pending clarification of legal authority." Lynch's refusal to cooperate with federal agents represented personal courage that could result in charges of obstruction or worse, but also bought precious time for Sanctuary Network members to coordinate responses to escalating threats. Chase moved to the window, using his military bearing to project authority while observing federal positions that were becoming increasingly aggressive in their deployment patterns. They're preparing for forced entry operations, multiple buildings simultaneously, designed to overwhelm resistance before organized defense can develop. The tactical assessment confirmed Nicole's suspicions that federal forces were moving beyond collection efforts toward military action against civilian populations. The escalation meant that her options had reduced to immediate flight or active resistance against opponents who possessed overwhelming advantages in equipment and authorization. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" she asked, understanding that tactical decisions required precise knowledge of available windows for action. Chase consulted his watch with the automatic precision that came from years of coordinating military operations under time pressure. "Based on current deployment patterns, forced entry operations will commence at 1800 hours. That gives us 47 minutes to implement whatever resistance or evacuation plans this community has prepared." Nicole felt familiar sensations that accompanied transition from planning to execution phases of complex operations. Heart rate stabilized, breathing deepened, and mental focus narrowed to essential considerations that would determine success or failure of actions taken under extreme pressure. Abigail appeared in the kitchen doorway, her 8-year-old instincts detecting adult tension despite efforts to shield her from dangerous realities. "Mommy, are we going on our adventure now?" The innocent question crystallized Nicole's understanding that her daughter's safety represented the only consideration that mattered regardless of institutional threats or constitutional violations. Every decision would be evaluated based on its potential to preserve Abigail's childhood and future rather than abstract principles about federal authority or veteran rights. "Soon, sweetheart," Nicole replied, forcing her voice to remain calm despite internal alarms that screamed about approaching violence and the collapse of everything she'd built to provide her daughter with stability. "Remember our practice games about staying close to mommy and following instructions quickly?" Abigail nodded with the solemn attention that children displayed when adults they trusted indicated that serious situations required careful behavior. Mason guided her back toward activities that would keep her occupied, while parents discussed topics that 8-year-olds shouldn't overhear. Eddie's radio brought updates from network members positioned throughout Summit View to monitor federal activities and coordinate resistance efforts. Newman reports federal agents conducting door-to-door searches in the residential district. They're not requesting permission or presenting warrants. Full military search patterns. The abandonment of constitutional protections confirmed that federal forces were operating under emergency authority that superseded civilian law enforcement protocols. Nicole understood that her community was now under military occupation disguised as counterterrorism operations. Chase produced tactical maps from his briefcase, spreading them across Mason's dining table with practiced efficiency. These show federal deployment patterns and potential escape routes through national forest land. But they also indicate something else. Nicole studied the maps, recognizing tactical symbols that revealed federal positioning designed to funnel refugees toward specific geographic choke points, rather than prevent all escape. They're not trying to capture everyone, they're directing us toward predetermined collection points. The realization transformed their understanding of federal strategy from comprehensive apprehension to selective harvesting of specific individuals whose capabilities made them valuable for classified operations. The sanctuary network was being sorted rather than eliminated, with families and support personnel treated as acceptable collateral casualties. Which means some of us are targets while others are expendable, Eddie concluded with the grim satisfaction of someone whose worst suspicions were being confirmed by developing events. Nicole felt the weight of command decisions that she'd never wanted to make again, but couldn't her daughter's safety and her community's survival now depended on leadership that no one else was positioned to provide. Her Team 7 experience included operations where tactical decisions determined whether civilians lived or died, and those skills were becoming relevant in ways she'd hoped never to experience again. "Mrs. Mason," she said quietly, "how many vehicles does this community have access to, and how many people can we move simultaneously through forest roads?" Mason consulted notes that suggested detailed evacuation planning had been conducted well in advance of current crisis. 14 vehicles with off-road capability, capacity for 32 adults and children. Forest Service roads provide access to Interstate 90, approximately 20 miles north of current federal positions. The numbers indicated that complete evacuation was possible if coordination could be maintained and federal interference prevented during movement phases. But successful escape would require sacrifices that Nicole wasn't certain anyone was prepared to make. Chase's secure phone displayed incoming messages that caused his expression to shift from concern to something approaching alarm. Federal reinforcements are en route from Fort Harrison. Estimated arrival in 90 minutes. They're bringing equipment that suggests preparation for prolonged military action rather than simple apprehension operations. The escalation meant that Summit View was about to become a battlefield where American military forces engaged American veterans and their families in combat operations that would never appear in official reports or congressional oversight hearings. Nicole made decisions that felt like stepping off precipices into darkness, understanding that her choices would determine whether her daughter grew up free or spent her childhood visiting her mother in federal detention facilities designed to house people whose continued existence posed threats to national security operations. "We're not running," she announced, her voice carrying authority that came from years of making life and death decisions under impossible pressure. Running means they win by default. And it means other sanctuary communities face the same choices without support or coordination. Chase studied her with the professional assessment that came from evaluating subordinates, whose capabilities would determine mission success or failure. Ms. Fleming, resistance against federal forces operating under executive authority could result in charges of domestic terrorism, treason, and armed rebellion against the United States government. Nicole met his gaze with the steady confidence that had once carried her through operations where failure meant death for everyone involved. "Colonel, participating in illegal operations against American veterans already constitutes treason against everything I swore to defend. The only question is whether we're going to fight for our principles or surrender them to people who see constitutional protections as obstacles to operational efficiency." Eddie moved to the radio, preparing to coordinate sanctuary network responses to federal escalation. "What are your orders, ma'am?" The question acknowledged Nicole's transition from refugee to resistance leader, accepting her authority based on operational experience and tactical capabilities that exceeded anyone else's qualification for command during military crisis. Nicole studied the tactical maps while calculating resources, timelines, and objectives that would determine whether Summit View's veteran community survived federal collection efforts with their freedom and families intact. First priority is civilian evacuation, she decided. Children, elderly, and non-combatants move north through forest roads immediately. Second priority is intelligence gathering about federal intentions and capabilities. Third priority is defensive preparation for anyone who chooses to remain and resist rather than run. The orders established clear priorities while providing choice for individuals whose personal circumstances might require different responses to institutional threats. Nicole understood that effective resistance required voluntary participation rather than conscripted service from people whose commitment to community defense might be compromised by concerns about family safety. Outside, engine sounds indicated federal positioning was entering final phases before operational commencement. The Sanctuary Network's 18 months of peaceful anonymity were officially over, replaced by circumstances that would determine whether American veterans retained the freedom to refuse participation in illegal operations against their fellow citizens. Nicole looked toward the kitchen where Abigail's laughter provided counterpoint to radio chatter about federal deployment patterns and resistance coordination. Her daughter's innocent joy represented everything worth fighting for, regardless of institutional power or government authority that claimed constitutional violations were necessary for national security. The battle for Summit View was about to begin, and Nicole Fleming was no longer hiding from her past, but embracing it to protect a future where children could grow up free from federal agencies that treated veterans as assets to be collected rather than citizens to be protected. The evacuation began with military precision that belied its civilian appearance. Within 10 minutes of Nicole's command decision, families throughout Summit View were implementing protocols that had been rehearsed as emergency drills but never executed, under conditions where federal forces maintained active surveillance of all movement within the community. Mrs. Mason coordinated the exodus from her kitchen table, using coded radio communications that disguised tactical instructions as routine neighborly conversation about carpooling arrangements and weekend camping trips. Caleb Dixon proved invaluable as a courier, his teenage familiarity with Summit View's back alleys and forest paths allowing him to move between houses without attracting federal attention. His mother Cheryl had closed the diner permanently, transforming the building into a communications hub, where handheld radios crackled with updates about federal positioning and civilian movement through evacuation routes that had been mapped years earlier, with exactly this scenario in mind. Phase 1 complete, Eddie Walsh reported through encrypted channels 12 non-combatants moving north through Sector 7. Estimated forest road access in 22 minutes. Nicole monitored the reports while studying federal deployment patterns that Chase continued updating based on military communications intercepts. The tactical situation was evolving rapidly, with federal forces demonstrating coordination that suggested extensive planning rather than improvised response to unexpected resistance. "They're not reacting to our movements," she observed, tracing federal positions on Mason's dining room map. "They're implementing predetermined strategy that accounts for evacuation attempts." Chase nodded grimly, his secure phone displaying intelligence that confirmed Nicole's assessment. Federal planners studied sanctuary community responses during tabletop exercises conducted 6 months ago. They know exactly how veteran networks would react to collection operations. The revelation that federal strategists had wargame scenarios involving resistance from sanctuary communities indicated institutional preparation for domestic military operations that extended far beyond current crisis. Someone with significant authority had been planning systematic action against veteran populations for months, while maintaining public pretense of supporting those who had served their country. Dr. Hunt's voice crackled through radio static as she provided medical support for evacuation operations while monitoring federal communications through equipment that exceeded standard civilian healthcare capabilities. Federal medical teams are positioning near potential casualty collection points. They're preparing for wounded rather than hoping to avoid confrontation. The medical preparations confirmed that federal forces anticipated violence rather than peaceful surrender, which meant that rules of engagement had been established permitting lethal force against American veterans and their families. Nicole felt familiar sensations that accompanied recognition of enemy intent to inflict casualties rather than simply achieve tactical objectives. Detective Bell's unmarked vehicle appeared on Forest Service roads that provided alternate routes around federal containment positions. Her arrival brought state police authority that might complicate federal operations while providing legal framework for resistance activities that could otherwise be classified as domestic terrorism. Constitutional violations are documented, Bell reported as she joined the command group at Mason's house. Executive Order 14,823 lacks proper congressional notification, violates posse comitatus restrictions on domestic military operations, and exceeds presidential authority for deploying armed forces against civilian populations. The legal analysis provided potential justification for resistance actions while confirming that federal operations were being conducted without legitimate authority. But Nicole understood that constitutional protections meant nothing if people willing to enforce them were eliminated before they could testify about violations they had witnessed. Sheriff Lynch's radio brought updates about federal attempts to establish cooperation with local law enforcement agencies throughout the region. State police are maintaining neutrality pending clarification of legal authority. Local sheriffs in 3 counties have refused to provide support for operations they consider constitutionally questionable. The breakdown in federal-local cooperation suggested that institutional resistance to illegal operations extended beyond Summit View's veteran community to include law enforcement personnel who took their oath to defend the Constitution seriously enough to risk career consequences. Abigail emerged from Mason's kitchen carrying a small backpack that contained everything she considered essential for their adventure. Her 8-year-old preparation included favorite books, stuffed animals, and drawings that represented security in a world where adult decisions were transforming familiar surroundings into something that resembled war zones rather than peaceful communities. "Mommy, when do we start our trip?" she asked, with the trusting expectation that adults she relied on would protect her from dangers she couldn't understand. Nicole knelt beside her daughter, forcing her voice to remain steady despite internal awareness that federal forces were preparing operations that might separate them permanently. "Very soon, sweetheart. Mrs. Patterson is going to drive you and some other children to a special camping place where you'll be safe while Mommy finishes some important work here." The explanation was carefully crafted to provide reassurance without deception, acknowledging separation while avoiding details about federal threats that would terrify a child whose security depended on believing that trusted adults could handle any problems that might develop. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson had arrived with the quiet efficiency that marked former military personnel implementing operational plans under time pressure. Her World War II nursing experience included evacuation procedures from combat zones, skills that remained relevant despite decades of peaceful civilian life. "We'll take good care of her," Patterson assured Nicole, understanding that separation from her daughter represented the most difficult decision any parent could face. "The forest camp has been prepared with everything children need for extended stays if circumstances require extended separation." Nicole forced herself to release Abigail's hand, understanding that her daughter's safety required distance from federal operations that treated family relationships as leverage for ensuring cooperation from targeted individuals. The evacuation represented both protection and potential permanent loss if resistance efforts failed to prevent federal collection of Sanctuary Network leadership. Chase monitored federal communications while calculating timeline pressures that were approaching critical thresholds. Forced entry operations commence in 18 minutes. Federal commanders are requesting final confirmation of rules of engagement that authorize lethal force against armed resistance. The countdown created urgency that focused remaining decisions on essential considerations. Nicole studied the tactical map while weighing options that offered no guarantee of success but provided alternatives to surrender that would result in indefinite detention and forced participation in illegal operations against American civilians. "Eddie, how many people are staying to resist?" she asked, understanding that defensive planning required accurate assessment of available personnel and capabilities. Eddie consulted radio reports from Sanctuary Network members who had chosen to remain despite opportunities for evacuation. 7 combat veterans with special operations backgrounds, 3 support personnel with medical and communications training, plus Sheriff Lynch and Detective Bell representing legitimate law enforcement authority. The numbers were sufficient for defensive operations but inadequate for offensive action against federal forces that possessed overwhelming advantages in equipment, authorization, and reinforcement capabilities. Nicole understood that their strategy required leverage beyond simple military resistance. Pastor Newman approached through Mason's back door, his arrival bringing intelligence about federal positioning around community buildings that served symbolic importance beyond tactical value. They've surrounded the church, the school, and the town hall. Classic hearts and minds positioning designed to minimize civilian casualties, while projecting federal authority over community institutions. The tactical assessment revealed federal strategy that combined military efficiency with political awareness of public relations implications if operations resulted in excessive civilian casualties, but it also indicated vulnerability to resistance tactics that forced federal commanders to choose between mission accomplishment and avoiding actions that would generate negative media coverage. Nicole made operational decisions that felt like placing bets with her life and her community's freedom as stakes. We're not defending buildings, we're defending principles. Federal forces want to avoid publicity about military action against American veterans, which means we need to ensure that whatever happens here gets documented and transmitted beyond Summit View. Chase understood the implications immediately. Media warfare rather than conventional resistance forced them to conduct illegal operations under public scrutiny that they can't control or suppress. The strategy required transformation from defensive military thinking to offensive information operations that might succeed, where direct confrontation would certainly fail. Nicole felt familiar adaptation sensations that came with recognizing that tactical situations required approaches that weren't covered in standard operational manuals. Cheryl Dixon's radio brought final updates about civilian evacuation status. All non-combatants clear of immediate danger zones. Forest roads remain open, but federal aerial assets are monitoring vehicle movement through thermal imaging. The successful evacuation of families and vulnerable community members provided tactical freedom for remaining Sanctuary Network personnel to implement resistance strategies without concerns about collateral casualties among people whose only connection to special operations involved residents in the same community. Detective Bell established communication with media contacts whose professional interest in government overreach stories might provide publicity that federal commanders preferred to avoid. Regional news crews are en route. Estimated arrival 40 minutes after federal operations commence, assuming they can penetrate federal perimeter controls. The media timeline created opportunity for documentation but also pressure to maintain resistance long enough for journalists to witness and report federal actions that violated constitutional protections and democratic governance principles. Nicole checked her personal equipment while calculating resource requirements for operations that might extend beyond immediate confrontation to include prolonged resistance against institutional forces whose patience for constitutional constraints was apparently exhausted. Her tactical vest contained communications gear, medical supplies, and documentation that would provide evidence of federal violations if she survived to testify about activities she was witnessing. But it also contained photographs of Abigail and personal mementos that represented everything worth protecting regardless of institutional power or government authority. Final communication check, Eddie announced, coordinating radio networks that would maintain connectivity between resistance positions despite federal electronic warfare capabilities designed to disrupt civilian communications during military operations. The technical preparations focused on practical requirements for coordinated action while acknowledging that federal resources included sophisticated surveillance and jamming equipment that could isolate individual defenders from mutual support networks. Comsted, Chase's secure phone displayed final intelligence updates that clarified federal operational parameters. Rules of engagement authorize lethal force against anyone displaying weapons or refusing compliance with federal commands. Medical evacuation procedures are established for both federal casualties and civilian wounded who don't pose ongoing threats. The clinical language couldn't disguise underlying reality that federal forces were prepared to kill American veterans whose only crime involved refusing to participate in illegal operations against their fellow citizens. Nicole understood that federal commanders had received authorization that transformed constitutional protests into armed rebellion subject to military suppression. Dr. Hunt completed medical preparations at her clinic, establishing trauma treatment capabilities for casualties that federal planning apparently considered inevitable. Surgical facilities are ready for emergency procedures. But extended treatment will require medical evacuation to facilities beyond federal control if resistance extends beyond immediate confrontation. The medical assessments confirm that resistance activities carried genuine risk of death or permanent injury for people whose military service had already cost them more than most civilians could understand. Nicole felt weight of command decisions that might result in additional casualties among veterans who had already sacrificed enough for their country. Sheriff Lynch's final tactical report confirmed federal positioning that surrounded Summit View's core residential and commercial areas, while leaving forest escape routes under surveillance but not physical control. They want us to know we're surrounded, but they're not preventing escape for people who choose to leave rather than resist. The federal positioning suggested final opportunity for Sanctuary Network members to abandon resistance in favor of exile that would preserve their lives while surrendering their community and principles to institutional forces that viewed constitutional protections as obstacles to operational efficiency. Nicole studied the faces of people who had chosen to remain despite risks that included death, imprisonment, and permanent separation from families they were trying to protect. Their expressions reflected determination that came from understanding that some principles were worth defending regardless of personal cost. Last chance to reconsider, she announced, providing final opportunity for anyone whose commitment to resistance might be undermined by realistic assessment of what they were facing. Federal forces have authorization to kill anyone who refuses compliance. No one will think less of you for choosing your family's safety over community defense. No one moved toward evacuation routes. The Sanctuary Network's core membership had made peace with consequences that couldn't be avoided through compromise or negotiation with institutional forces, whose patience for constitutional constraints had apparently been exhausted by operational requirements. Eddie's radio crackled with final federal communication that marked transition from positioning to execution phases of collection operations. All units commence Operation Homecoming. Repeat, Operation Homecoming is active. Secure all designated targets with minimum necessary force. The code name's ironic reference to veteran reintegration couldn't disguise underlying reality that federal forces were beginning military action against American veterans, whose service had earned them protection rather than persecution. Nicole felt familiar calm that preceded decisive action under conditions where hesitation meant death. The battle for Summit View's Sanctuary Network was officially beginning, and Nicole Fleming was no longer the frightened waitress who had spilled coffee on a colonel's uniform 12 hours earlier. She was Ghost 7, Team 7 commander, and someone who understood that freedom required vigilance against all enemies, foreign and domestic, regardless of which uniforms they wore or which authority they claimed to represent. The first federal team approached the diner with textbook precision, their movements coordinated through hand signals that betrayed training far beyond standard law enforcement procedures. Nicole watched through Dr. Hunt's clinic window as 6 agents in tactical gear established firing positions around Cheryl's building, their weapons trained on entrances while team leaders communicated through throat microphones that connected them to command structures operating beyond local oversight. Agent Morrison emerged from the lead vehicle wearing body armor that transformed his bureaucratic appearance into something more militaristic and threatening. His earlier attempt at civilized federal collection had been replaced by operational authority that apparently included whatever force might be necessary to accomplish mission objectives that extended beyond simple apprehension of individual targets. Federal agents execute search warrant for terrorist materials and weapons violations, Morrison announced through a bullhorn that carried his voice across Summit View's main commercial district. All occupants exit with hands visible and comply with lawful federal commands. The warrant claim was theater designed to provide legal justification for actions that violated constitutional protections, but Nicole understood that federal forces were operating under emergency authority that superseded normal judicial oversight. Morrison's announcement was meant for recording devices rather than actual legal compliance. Eddie Walsh's voice crackled through encrypted radio channels that connected resistance positions throughout the community. Diner entry team consists of 6 tactical agents plus sniper overwatch on the post office roof. Standard federal assault configuration for high-value target apprehension. Nicole coordinated defensive responses while monitoring federal communications that Chase continued intercepting through military frequencies that civilian law enforcement shouldn't have access to. The intelligence revealed coordination between federal agencies and military units that suggested domestic operations had been authorized at levels that bypassed congressional notification requirements. Pattern matches overseas counterinsurgency doctrine, Chase reported from his position at Mason's house, where he maintained communication with sources inside federal command structures. They're treating Summit View as hostile territory requiring military pacification rather than civilian law enforcement. The tactical assessment confirmed Nicole's understanding that federal forces were implementing warfare strategies against American civilians, which meant that rules of engagement might not distinguish between combatants and bystanders if resistance developed beyond their operational parameters. Dr. Hunt activated recording equipment that would document federal actions for media transmission and potential legal proceedings, assuming anyone survived to provide testimony about constitutional violations they were witnessing. Her medical training included combat zone documentation procedures that might prove valuable for establishing evidence of government overreach. Broadcasting on emergency frequencies, quote, she announced, ensuring that federal operations would be monitored by media outlets and civil liberties organizations whose interest in government accountability might provide protection through public scrutiny that federal commanders preferred to avoid. Sheriff Lynch positioned himself at the intersection of Main Street and Forest Avenue, his uniform and badge providing legitimate law enforcement presence that complicated federal claims about terrorist apprehension operations. His radio communications were being transmitted directly to state police headquarters, creating official record of events that federal agencies might prefer to suppress. This is Sheriff Gary Lynch, Summit View, Montana, requesting immediate state police backup for federal operation that appears to exceed legal authority. He announced through channels that would be monitored by multiple agencies and oversight organizations. Federal agents are conducting military-style operations against American veterans without proper constitutional justification. Lynch's official protest created bureaucratic complications for federal commanders, whose operations required coordination with local authorities to maintain appearance of legitimate law enforcement rather than military occupation of civilian territory. Detective Bell's unmarked vehicle arrived at the town's northern perimeter just as federal agents were demanding entry to the diner through loudspeaker announcements that carried undertones of threat rather than standard police procedure. Her state police authority provided additional legitimate oversight that federal operations would need to address or override through claims of national security emergency. Federal agents, this is Detective Christina Bell, Montana State Police, she announced through her patrol radio on frequencies that would be recorded by dispatch centers across the region. I'm observing what appears to be military action against civilian populations without proper state notification or legal authorization. The official challenges from multiple law enforcement agencies created documentation that federal commanders couldn't suppress without acknowledging that their operations were being conducted outside normal legal frameworks that govern domestic law enforcement activities. Nicole felt familiar sensations that accompanied transition from defensive planning to active resistance under conditions where hesitation could result in casualties among people whose safety had become her responsibility. Team 7 training included scenarios where conventional tactics were inadequate, and mission success required improvisation under extreme pressure. Phase 2 implementation. She announced through encrypted communications that connected resistance positions with coordinated timing that federal electronic warfare capabilities hadn't yet succeeded in disrupting. Media documentation takes priority over tactical engagement. The strategy acknowledged that direct military confrontation with federal forces would result in casualties that wouldn't advance their strategic objectives, while forcing federal commanders to conduct illegal operations under public scrutiny that might accomplish more than conventional resistance. Pastor Newman's church bells began ringing with the steady rhythm that had historically summoned community members during emergencies, but now served to attract media attention while providing audio backdrop for recording devices that were documenting federal actions for transmission beyond Summit View's communication blackout. Morrison's team entered the diner through forced entry that shattered the front door and scattered glass across linoleum floors where Nicole had served coffee to the same federal agent 12 hours earlier. The violence of their approach contradicted claims about routine administrative investigation and revealed operational intent that extended beyond peaceful apprehension of suspected individuals. Chase's intelligence updates provided real-time assessment of federal tactical deployment that was expanding beyond the diner to include systematic searches of residential properties where Sanctuary Network members had been identified through surveillance operations that had been monitoring the community for months. Simultaneous entry teams targeting 14 residential addresses. He reported through secure communications that somehow maintained functionality despite federal electronic warfare capabilities. They're not looking for weapons or evidence. They're collecting specific individuals whose names appear on classified target lists. The revelation that federal forces possessed detailed intelligence about Sanctuary Network membership confirmed that Operation Homecoming represented systematic action against veteran populations rather than response to immediate threats or criminal activities. Nicole coordinated resistance responses that prioritize documentation over direct confrontation, understanding that their strategic objective required evidence of federal overreach rather than military victory against forces that possessed overwhelming tactical advantages. All units maintain recording protocols. She instructed through radio networks that connected defensive positions throughout Summit View. Federal forces want to conduct illegal operations without witnesses. Our mission is ensuring that everything they do gets documented and transmitted beyond their control. The strategy transformed traditional military thinking about defending territory into information warfare that might succeed where conventional resistance would certainly fail. Nicole was applying special operations principles to domestic resistance against institutional forces whose authority depended on operating beyond public scrutiny. Dr. Hunt's emergency broadcasts reached regional media outlets whose news crews were already responding to reports about federal military action against veteran communities in Montana. The publicity created time pressure for federal commanders whose operations required completion before journalists could arrive to document actions that might not survive constitutional challenge. News crews from Billings and Great Falls en route, Hunt reported through medical emergency frequencies that federal forces hadn't anticipated would be used for tactical coordination. Estimated arrival 37 minutes. Helicopter news teams could arrive sooner if weather permits aerial coverage. The media timeline created operational urgency for federal forces while providing hope that resistance activities might only need to maintain effectiveness until professional journalists could witness and report government actions that violated democratic principles and constitutional protections. Hopeful, Eddie Walsh's tactical assessment revealed federal positioning that suggested preparation for prolonged operations rather than quick collection of targeted individuals. Heavy equipment moving into positions around community perimeter, they're establishing sustained operational capability rather than planning rapid withdrawal. The federal commitment to extended operations indicated institutional determination to complete mission objectives, regardless of legal challenges or media coverage that might complicate their activities through public exposure of domestic military operations. Nicole felt weight of command decisions that were determining not only immediate tactical outcomes but potentially the future relationship between American veterans and government institutions that were supposed to protect rather than persecute those who had served their country with distinction. Morrison's voice carried through the diner's shattered windows as his team conducted searches that were producing evidence of the civilian business operations they were supposedly investigating. Target structures contain no weapons, no terrorist materials, no evidence of criminal activity. Proceeding to secondary objectives. The admission that their searches were producing no evidence of illegal activities confirmed that federal operations were designed to collect individuals rather than investigate crimes, which meant that their legal justification was fabricated to provide cover for actions that served other purposes entirely. Sheriff Lynch's position at the main intersection provided clear view of federal operations while ensuring that his official observations would be recorded through multiple communication channels that federal forces couldn't monitor or suppress without acknowledging that they were conducting activities requiring information control. Federal agents are conducting warrantless searches of civilian properties. He reported through state police frequencies, no evidence of criminal activity discovered, but searches continuing under claimed national security authority that appears to exceed legal parameters for domestic operations. Lynch's official testimony created contemporaneous record of federal actions that would be available for legal proceedings and congressional oversight hearings if anyone survived to provide additional testimony about constitutional violations they were witnessing. Detective Bell's arrival at federal perimeter positions forced command decisions about whether to continue operations under legitimate law enforcement observation or escalate to direct confrontation with state police authority that might attract additional unwanted scrutiny from oversight organizations. Federal agents, this is Detective Bell requesting immediate conference with Operation Commander regarding legal authority for current activities. She announced through official channels while positioning her vehicle to record federal responses to legitimate law enforcement challenges. State police require clarification of constitutional authority for military operations against civilian populations. The official challenge forced federal commanders to either provide legal justification for their activities or acknowledge that their operations were being conducted outside normal oversight mechanisms that governed domestic law enforcement coordination. Nicole monitored federal radio traffic that was revealing increasing frustration with resistance strategies that weren't providing targets for conventional military responses while creating publicity problems that complicated their mission objectives through unwanted transparency. Federal commanders are requesting authorization for escalated rules of engagement, Chase reported through encrypted communications. Higher authority is apparently concerned about media coverage and its potential impact on political support for domestic counterterrorism operations. The intelligence suggested that federal operations were encountering political constraints that might provide protection through institutional mechanisms that valued public perception over tactical efficiency in domestic operations that required democratic legitimacy. Pastor Newman's position at the church provided observation of federal tactical deployment while ensuring that religious sanctuary principles were being documented for legal and media purposes that might complicate federal claims about national security emergency authority. Federal forces are surrounding religious facilities, he reported through emergency communications networks. Historical precedent suggests that military action against churches creates political complications that government officials prefer to avoid during operations requiring public support. The assessment acknowledged that federal commanders were dealing with political considerations that extended beyond tactical objectives, to include constitutional principles and democratic legitimacy that might constrain their operational choices despite emergency authority claims. Nicole felt familiar adaptation sensations that came with recognizing that battlefield conditions required tactical adjustments that weren't covered in standard operational manuals, but might determine mission success under circumstances where conventional approaches were inadequate for strategic objectives. Dr. Hunt's medical monitoring revealed federal preparations for casualty treatment that suggested operational planners had calculated acceptable loss rates for resistance activities, while establishing medical evacuation procedures for federal personnel who might be wounded during collection operations. Federal medical teams are positioning trauma treatment facilities, she observed through encrypted communications. They're preparing for wounded rather than hoping to complete operations without casualties. Someone has authorized lethal force against American veterans. The medical preparations confirmed that federal rules of engagement included authorization for violence that might result in deaths among people whose military service had earned them protection rather than persecution from government institutions they had sworn to defend. Outside, the sound of approaching helicopters indicated that federal reinforcements were arriving to support ground operations that had apparently encountered more organized resistance than operational planners had anticipated based on their assessment of veteran community capabilities and coordination. Nicole understood that the next phase of Operation Homecoming would determine whether Summit View's sanctuary network survived as a symbol of successful resistance to institutional overreach, or became an example of what happened to veterans who refused cooperation with government agencies that viewed constitutional protections as obstacles to operational efficiency. The battle for Summit View was entering its critical phase, and every decision made in the next hour would determine whether American veterans retained the freedom to refuse participation in illegal operations against their fellow citizens. The news helicopter appeared over Summit View's eastern ridge, 37 minutes ahead of federal estimates, its arrival fundamentally altering operational dynamics in ways that no amount of tactical planning could have anticipated. Channel 8 News from Billings had responded to Dr. Hunt's emergency broadcasts with the kind of aggressive journalism that transformed routine government operations into public accountability moments that politicians preferred to avoid during election cycles. Federal commanders found themselves conducting domestic military operations under live television coverage that would be transmitted to audiences across Montana and potentially nationwide through network affiliate agreements that amplified local news into national consciousness. The strategic implications were immediate and devastating for institutional forces whose effectiveness depended on operating beyond public scrutiny. Nicole coordinated resistance responses from Dr. Hunt's clinic while monitoring news coverage that was already describing federal actions as military-style raids against American veterans in language that carried political implications extending far beyond Summit View's immediate crisis. The media narrative was crystallizing around themes that federal public relations departments had apparently failed to anticipate or control. This is Jessica Martinez reporting live from Summit View, Montana, where federal agents are conducting what appears to be coordinated military action against a community of military veterans. Quote, the television journalist announced through loudspeakers that carried her voice across the main commercial district, where federal tactical teams were maintaining positions around civilian buildings. Morrison's response to unexpected media presence revealed operational priorities that hadn't been designed to withstand transparency requirements of democratic governance. His tactical teams were trained for military efficiency rather than public relations, and their aggressive posture was creating exactly the kind of imagery that federal commanders must have hoped to avoid. Federal agents, this is Jessica Martinez with Channel 8 News. The journalist called out through the helicopter's external speakers. Can you provide comment about the legal authority for military operations against civilian populations? The direct challenge forced federal commanders to either engage with media questions that might reveal uncomfortable truths about their operational authority, or ignore legitimate journalistic inquiry in ways that would confirm suspicions about government overreach and constitutional violations. Chase's intelligence intercepts revealed emergency communications between field commanders and federal headquarters that indicated growing concern about political implications of media coverage that was developing beyond anyone's ability to control or suppress. Federal Command is requesting immediate legal assessment of media management options, he reported through encrypted channels. Someone very senior is apparently watching live television coverage and asking uncomfortable questions about operational authorization. The political pressure suggested that institutional forces supporting Operation Homecoming might be reconsidering their commitment to domestic military operations that were creating exactly the kind of public relations disasters that government officials worked desperately to avoid. Detective Bell seized the media opportunity by positioning herself directly in front of news cameras while providing official law enforcement commentary that would be broadcast alongside footage of federal tactical operations. I'm Detective Christina Bell with Montana State Police. What you're seeing is federal agents conducting military-style operations against American veterans without proper state notification or apparent constitutional authority. Her testimony provided official law enforcement perspective that contradicted federal claims about routine counterterrorism operations, while creating legal record that would be preserved through broadcast footage and journalistic documentation that federal agencies couldn't suppress or classify. Sheriff Lynch joined Bell in front of the news cameras, his uniform and badge providing additional legitimate authority for statements that challenged federal operations through channels that would reach audiences far beyond Summit View's immediate crisis. These federal agents have refused to provide legal justification for military action against civilians who have committed no crimes and pose no threats to public safety. The combined law enforcement testimony created contemporaneous official record of constitutional violations that would be available for congressional oversight hearings and federal court proceedings if anyone survived to provide additional evidence about government actions they were witnessing. Nicole felt tactical situations shifting as media presence transformed federal operations from discrete collection activities into public relations disasters that threatened institutional credibility and political support for domestic counterterrorism programs that required democratic legitimacy to maintain funding and authorization. All units, media documentation is achieving strategic objectives, she announced through Resistance Communication Networks. Federal forces are losing operational initiative due to transparency requirements they weren't prepared to handle. The assessment acknowledged that information warfare was succeeding where conventional military resistance would have failed, forcing federal commanders to choose between completing their mission objectives and avoiding political consequences that might threaten broader institutional interests. Pastor Newman emerged from his church carrying documentation that would provide religious perspective on federal operations, while ensuring that faith community concerns were included in media coverage that was already focusing on constitutional and legal violations. These federal agents are violating principles of religious sanctuary that have been respected by legitimate authorities for centuries, he announced to news cameras while positioning himself between federal tactical teams and civilian buildings. The religious dimension added moral authority to resistance activities, while creating additional political complications for federal commanders, whose operations were now being challenged by multiple legitimate institutions whose authority derived from democratic processes rather than emergency executive orders. Dr. Hunt's medical monitoring revealed federal command communications that indicated growing frustration with operational developments that weren't proceeding according to predetermined timelines and tactical assumptions. Federal commanders are requesting permission to establish media exclusion zones, she reported through emergency frequencies. Higher authority is apparently concerned about continued television coverage of domestic military operations. The request for media exclusion suggested that federal forces were recognizing that transparency was undermining their mission effectiveness while creating political vulnerabilities that threatened institutional support for activities that required public ignorance to maintain legitimacy. The Channel 8 helicopter circled Summit View's perimeter while providing aerial footage that revealed the full scope of federal tactical deployment around a small community whose only apparent crime involved housing veterans who refused participation in classified operations against their fellow citizens. The visual documentation was creating exactly the kind of evidence that congressional oversight committees and civil liberties organizations would use to challenge executive authority and demand accountability. From our aerial position, we can see what appears to be a military-style containment operation surrounding the entire community of Summit View. Jessica Martinez reported through broadcast equipment that was transmitting live footage to audiences across the region. Federal tactical teams have established positions around civilian buildings while local law enforcement officials are challenging their legal authority. The journalistic description was transforming federal operations from routine administrative activities into something that resembled military occupation of civilian territory, creating political implications that extended far beyond immediate tactical objectives to include fundamental questions about constitutional governance and democratic oversight. Eddie Walsh's tactical assessment confirmed that federal positioning was becoming defensive rather than offensive, as media presence created constraints that hadn't been included in operational planning. Federal teams are consolidating positions around fewer buildings while avoiding actions that would create negative imagery for television coverage, he observed through encrypted communications. The behavioral changes indicated that federal commanders were recognizing that media documentation was transforming their tactical environment in ways that required operational adjustments to minimize political damage from activities that were supposed to remain hidden from public scrutiny. Nicole coordinated final resistance activities while understanding that media presence had created opportunity for strategic victory that didn't require military confrontation or casualties among people whose safety had become her primary responsibility. The information warfare approach was achieving objectives that conventional resistance couldn't have accomplished. Prepare for federal withdrawal, she instructed through radio networks that connected defensive positions throughout Summit View. Media coverage is creating political pressure that federal commanders weren't prepared to handle. They're losing institutional support for continued operations. The assessment proved accurate as Morrison's voice crackled through federal communications that Chase continued intercepting despite electronic warfare attempts to maintain operational security. Base Command, requesting immediate clarification of rules of engagement for operations under active media surveillance. Current tactical situation is creating political complications beyond field resolution. The request revealed that federal field commanders were recognizing that their operational environment had been fundamentally altered by transparency requirements that transformed domestic military operations into public accountability moments that threatened institutional credibility. Federal helicopter reinforcements that had been approaching Summit View received new orders that diverted them from landing zones to holding patterns that kept military aircraft beyond television camera range, while commanders apparently received guidance about managing operations that were no longer proceeding according to predetermined tactical assumptions. All federal units implement Phase 3 withdrawal protocols, Morrison announced through communications that were being monitored by multiple agencies and transmitted to oversight organizations whose interest in government accountability was now focused on Summit View's developing crisis. The withdrawal order confirmed that institutional forces supporting Operation Homecoming had made strategic decision to abandon immediate tactical objectives rather than continue operations under media scrutiny that was creating political vulnerabilities extending far beyond veteran community concerns to include fundamental questions about constitutional governance. Nicole felt familiar sensations that accompanied successful mission completion under conditions where tactical objectives had been achieved through strategic thinking rather than conventional military confrontation. The Sanctuary Network had successfully resisted federal collection efforts, while forcing institutional recognition that domestic military operations required public support that couldn't be maintained through secrecy and constitutional violations. Detective Bell provided final official commentary for news cameras, while federal tactical teams conducted withdrawal operations that were being documented through broadcast footage that would be preserved as evidence of government overreach and constitutional violations. What we've witnessed here today represents successful community resistance to federal operations that appear to have been conducted without proper legal authority, she announced to television audiences across Montana and potentially nationwide. The official assessment created legal record that would be available for congressional oversight hearings and federal court proceedings, while providing political framework for institutional reforms that might prevent similar operations against veteran communities in other sanctuary locations. Sheriff Lynch's final statement to media representatives summarized law enforcement perspective on federal operations that had been successfully challenged through legitimate channels that preserve democratic governance and constitutional protections. Local law enforcement will continue monitoring federal activities to ensure that government operations within our jurisdiction comply with constitutional requirements and respect the rights of American citizens. The commitment to continued oversight created institutional accountability that would extend beyond immediate crisis to include ongoing protection for veteran communities whose security depended on legitimate authorities maintaining vigilance against government overreach and constitutional violations. As federal tactical teams loaded equipment into vehicles that would carry them away from Summit View, Nicole understood that their victory represented more than successful resistance to immediate threats. They had demonstrated that institutional power could be challenged through democratic processes that preserved constitutional protections while forcing government accountability through transparency that politicians and federal commanders couldn't suppress or ignore. Chase's final intelligence update confirmed that Operation Homecoming was being suspended nationwide, pending political review of media coverage that had transformed routine counterterrorism activities in public relations disasters, threatening institutional support for domestic military programs. Federal headquarters is requesting immediate assessment of political damage control options, he reported through secure communications. Someone very senior is apparently concerned about congressional oversight implications of today's media coverage. The political implications suggested that Summit View's successful resistance might provide protection for other sanctuary communities while forcing institutional reforms that would prevent similar operations against veteran populations who had earned protection rather than persecution from government agencies they had served with distinction. Nicole emerged from Dr. Hunt's clinic as federal vehicles departed Summit View's main commercial district, understanding that their community had survived institutional threats that might have destroyed everything they had worked to build and protect. The Sanctuary Network's 18 months of careful community building had proven strong enough to resist federal forces, whose authority depended on public ignorance rather than democratic legitimacy. The news helicopter continued circling overhead, ensuring that federal withdrawal would be documented as thoroughly as their arrival and deployment had been recorded for political and legal purposes that would extend far beyond immediate crisis to include ongoing protection for veteran communities whose security required vigilance against government overreach. Pastor Newman's church bells resumed their celebratory rhythm, announcing to Summit View's residents that federal threats had been successfully resisted through community coordination and strategic thinking that had preserved both their freedom and their principles without requiring casualties among people whose military service had already cost them more than most civilians could understand. The battle for Summit View was over, but Nicole understood that their victory represented beginning rather than conclusion of broader struggle to protect veteran communities from institutional forces that viewed constitutional protections as obstacles to operational efficiency in domestic operations that served political rather than national security objectives. 3 hours after the last federal vehicle disappeared beyond Summit View's eastern hills, Abigail Fleming raced across Mrs. Patterson's back meadow with the unbridled joy that only children could summon after adults had successfully resolved crises they couldn't fully comprehend. Her small arms wrapped around Nicole's waist with fierce determination, as if physical contact could somehow prevent future separations that might threaten the security she'd found in their carefully constructed life together. "Mommy, Mrs. Patterson said you were helping other people stay safe," Abigail whispered against Nicole's shoulder. "Are the bad people gone now?" Nicole knelt to meet her daughter's concerned gaze, understanding that 8-year-old questions deserved honest answers that acknowledged danger without creating unnecessary fear about threats that had been successfully resolved. "The people who wanted to hurt our friends have gone away, sweetheart, and our whole community worked together to make sure everyone stayed safe." The explanation provided reassurance while introducing concepts about collective security and mutual protection that would help Abigail understand why their life in Summit View involved relationships with neighbors whose dedication to each other extended beyond simple friendship to include shared commitment to protecting families and preserving freedom. Mrs. Patterson approached with the measured pace of someone whose wartime nursing experience had taught her to recognize when medical attention was needed for wounds that weren't always visible to casual observation. "Dr. Hunt wants to check everyone who remained during the federal operations. Standard protocol for trauma assessment and stress evaluation." The medical evaluation represented practical care for people whose resistance activities had involved psychological pressures that could manifest in delayed symptoms requiring professional attention and ongoing monitoring by healthcare providers who understood the specific challenges faced by veterans dealing with institutional betrayal. Colonel Chase stood near the forest edge where evacuation vehicles were returning families to homes they'd left hours earlier, with no guarantee that Summit View would remain habitable, or that federal forces wouldn't return with different strategies for accomplishing objectives that had been temporarily frustrated rather than permanently abandoned. His presence among returning civilians represented complete transformation from military officer enforcing government policies to community member whose allegiance had shifted to principles that transcended institutional loyalty, when institutional authority violated constitutional protections and democratic governance. "Ms. Fleming," he said as Nicole approached with Abigail's hand firmly clasped in her own, "I've received word from Washington about congressional response to today's media coverage. The House Oversight Committee is launching immediate investigation into Executive Order 14,823 and all related domestic military operations." The political implications suggested that Summit View's successful resistance had created momentum for institutional accountability that might prevent similar operations against other sanctuary communities, while forcing broader examination of executive authority and constitutional limitations on domestic military deployment. Detective Bell's unmarked vehicle arrived carrying documentation that would provide legal foundation for congressional oversight hearings and federal court challenges to executive orders that exceeded presidential authority while violating constitutional protections that governed government interaction with civilian populations. Federal prosecutors in 3 states are reviewing today's events for potential criminal charges against agents who conducted unauthorized military operations, she announced to community members who were gathering in the town square where Pastor Newman had organized informal celebration that acknowledged their collective achievement while honoring those who had risked everything for community protection. The legal developments indicated that accountability might extend beyond political embarrassment to include criminal prosecution of federal personnel who had participated in operations that violated their oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Sheriff Lynch's radio crackled with updates from law enforcement agencies across Montana and neighboring states where similar federal operations had been suspended following political pressure generated by Summit View's media coverage and successful resistance to institutional overreach. 6 sanctuary communities report federal withdrawal after congressional inquiries began. He announced to assembled residents whose celebration was tempered by understanding that their victory represented beginning rather than conclusion of broader struggle to protect veteran rights and constitutional governance. Dr. Hunt emerged from her clinic carrying medical reports that documented stress responses and minor injuries sustained during resistance activities, but also psychological assessments that revealed remarkable resilience among community members whose military experience had prepared them for exactly the kind of institutional challenges they had successfully navigated. "Everyone's physically fine," she reported with professional satisfaction. More importantly, psychological evaluations indicate that community cohesion and mutual support networks prevented the kind of trauma symptoms that often develop when people face existential threats to their security and freedom. The medical assessment confirmed that Summit View's veteran network had functioned exactly as intended, providing mutual protection and psychological support that allowed individuals to face institutional threats without experiencing lasting damage to their mental health or community relationships. Eddie Walsh coordinated the return of monitoring equipment and tactical communications gear that had enabled resistance coordination while documenting federal activities for legal and media purposes that would ensure accountability for government actions that violated democratic principles and constitutional protections. Federal surveillance equipment around town perimeter has been removed, he reported to Nicole, acknowledging her leadership role in community security decisions that would determine how Summit View managed future threats to their collective safety and individual freedom. The intelligence indicated that federal forces had abandoned their containment positions, while removing evidence of surveillance operations that had been monitoring sanctuary network activities for months before Operation Homecoming had been authorized through executive authority that apparently lacked constitutional legitimacy. Cheryl Dixon reopened the diner with characteristic determination, understanding that community normalcy required resumption of daily routines that provided stability and continuity despite recent events that had transformed their understanding of federal government attitudes toward veteran populations. "Coffee's fresh and breakfast is on the house for anyone who helped protect our town," she announced to residents who were slowly returning to normal activities while processing recent events that had revealed both institutional threats and community strengths they hadn't fully appreciated during 18 months of peaceful coexistence. The gesture represented more than simple hospitality, acknowledging that community survival had required contributions from everyone whose presence and participation had created the social fabric that enabled successful resistance to federal forces that possessed overwhelming tactical advantages but lacked democratic legitimacy. Nicole studied the familiar interior of Dixon's Diner, where her morning encounter with Colonel Chase had initiated events that revealed the true scope of federal operations against sanctuary communities, while demonstrating that resistance was possible when people committed to constitutional principles were willing to stand together against institutional overreach. The spilled coffee stain remained on the floor where their confrontation had begun, a reminder that seemingly minor incidents could trigger major consequences when they revealed truths that powerful people preferred to keep hidden from public scrutiny and democratic accountability. Caleb Dixon approached with teenage enthusiasm for recent events that had transformed his understanding of adult responsibilities and community obligations that extended beyond personal interests to include protection of neighbors whose military service had earned them security rather than persecution from government agencies. "Miss Fleming, my mom says you're going to help organize community defense training for people who want to learn how to protect themselves if federal agents come back," he said with the kind of respect that young people reserved for adults whose actions had demonstrated genuine commitment to principles worth defending. The proposal represented logical evolution of resistance activities from crisis response to ongoing preparation for future threats that might require different approaches but would certainly demand the same level of community coordination and individual courage that had enabled their recent victory. Nicole considered the implications of formal defense training that would transform Summit View from accidental sanctuary into intentional fortress capable of protecting veteran communities throughout the region from institutional forces whose authority depended on public ignorance rather than democratic legitimacy. "Community defense training makes sense," she agreed, understanding that their success had created responsibilities for sharing knowledge and capabilities with other sanctuary locations whose security depended on lessons learned through Summit View's confrontation with federal overreach. Pastor Newman's church bells announced evening service that would provide spiritual framework for processing recent events while acknowledging divine providence that had enabled community survival despite facing institutional threats that possessed unlimited resources and legal authority. "Tonight's service will focus on gratitude for protection received and wisdom for challenges that remain," he announced to residents whose faith had sustained them through crisis, while providing moral foundation for resistance activities that prioritized constitutional principles over institutional compliance. The religious perspective added moral dimension to their victory while acknowledging that future security would require continued vigilance against government agencies whose respect for constitutional limitations depended on political pressure rather than institutional commitment to democratic governance. Mayor Larry Cox appeared at the town square with official proclamation that would establish Summit View as sanctuary municipality committed to protecting veteran populations from federal operations that violated constitutional protections and democratic oversight requirements. By unanimous vote of the town council, Summit View hereby declares itself a constitutional sanctuary city dedicated to protecting American veterans from government agencies that exceed their legal authority. He announced to assembled residents whose applause acknowledged both their collective achievement and ongoing commitment to principles worth defending. The official designation created legal framework for continued resistance while attracting support from civil liberties organizations and congressional representatives, whose oversight responsibilities included protection of constitutional rights and limitation of executive authority. Nicole felt weight of leadership responsibilities that extended beyond immediate community concerns to include coordination with other sanctuary locations whose security might depend on lessons learned and capabilities developed through Summit View's successful resistance to institutional overreach. Her transformation from hidden refugee to acknowledged community leader represented personal growth that paralleled Summit View's evolution from accidental sanctuary to intentional fortress, capable of protecting veteran populations whose service had earned them protection rather than persecution from government agencies. Chase approached with official documents that would establish his resignation from military service and his commitment to Summit View's sanctuary mission as civilian advisor whose institutional knowledge could help prepare community defenses against future federal operations. "I've submitted formal resignation to Pentagon leadership along with detailed report about constitutional violations observed during Operation Homecoming," he explained with quiet satisfaction. Congressional oversight committees will have everything they need to prevent similar operations and prosecute officials who authorized illegal activities. His decision to sacrifice military career for community protection represented complete transformation from institutional enforcer to principled defender of constitutional rights and veteran welfare that transcended personal advancement or government loyalty. Detective Bell's final report documented federal violations that would provide evidence for congressional hearings and federal court challenges, while establishing legal precedent that might protect other sanctuary communities from similar operations conducted without proper constitutional authority. Federal operations against Summit View violated Fourth Amendment protections, exceeded executive authority, and constituted illegal deployment of military forces against civilian populations, she announced to media representatives who continued documenting aftermath of successful community resistance. The legal assessment created official record that would be preserved for future reference, while providing foundation for institutional reforms that might prevent similar operations against veteran populations whose service had earned them protection rather than exploitation. As evening settled over Summit View's main commercial district, Nicole understood that their victory represented more than successful crisis management. They had demonstrated that institutional power could be challenged through democratic processes that preserved constitutional protections while forcing government accountability. Abigail's laughter carried from the playground where children whose families had been successfully protected were resuming normal activities despite recent events that had revealed both institutional threats and community strengths that enabled effective resistance to government overreach. The sound of childhood joy represented everything worth protecting, regardless of institutional power or federal authority that claimed constitutional violations were necessary for national security operations that served political rather than democratic objectives. Nicole looked around the community square where residents were celebrating survival while acknowledging responsibilities for protecting other sanctuary locations whose security might depend on lessons learned through Summit View's confrontation with federal forces that possessed unlimited resources but lacked democratic legitimacy. Their 18 months of careful community building had proven strong enough to resist institutional threats while creating foundation for ongoing protection of veteran populations whose military service had earned them freedom rather than federal supervision or forced participation in illegal operations. The battle for Summit View was over, but Nicole understood that their victory represented beginning of broader movement to protect constitutional rights and veteran welfare from government agencies, whose authority required democratic oversight rather than emergency executive orders that violated fundamental principles of American governance. Mrs. Mason approached with evening meal preparations that would bring community members together for shared celebration of survival, while planning continued resistance activities that might be necessary to protect their collective security and individual freedom. "Tonight we celebrate," she announced with grandmother wisdom that acknowledged both achievement and ongoing challenges. "Tomorrow we begin preparing for whatever comes next, because freedom requires constant vigilance against those who see constitutional protections as obstacles to their authority." The assessment captured essential truth about democratic governance that required citizen engagement and institutional accountability to prevent government overreach and protect individual rights from agencies whose authority depended on public ignorance rather than constitutional legitimacy. Nicole accepted her role as community leader while understanding that her daughter's future depended on continued vigilance against institutional forces whose respect for constitutional limitations required political pressure rather than voluntary compliance with democratic principles. As stars appeared over Summit View's peaceful streets, the sounds of community celebration provided counterpoint to radio chatter about congressional investigations and federal accountability that might extend beyond immediate crises to include fundamental reforms in government authority and constitutional oversight. The Sanctuary Network had survived its first major test while demonstrating that American veterans retained both the capability and determination to defend constitutional principles against all enemies, foreign and domestic, regardless of which uniforms they wore or which authority they claimed to represent. Nicole Fleming was no longer hiding from her past but embracing a future where her military experience served community protection rather than institutional objectives, where her daughter could grow up free from federal agencies that treated veterans as assets rather than citizens, and where constitutional principles meant more than words on paper because people were willing to defend them with everything they possessed. The quiet waitress who had spilled coffee on a colonel's uniform 12 hours earlier had become a symbol of resistance that would inspire veteran communities across the nation to stand together against institutional forces whose authority required democratic legitimacy rather than emergency executive orders that violated everything they had sworn to defend. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoy this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.